The American Flag by Henry Ward Beecher. From Standard Selections, a collection and adaptation of superior productions from the best authors for use in classroom and on the platform. Arranged and edited by Robert I. Fulton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Dale Grothmann. The American Flag by Henry Ward Beecher. A thoughtful mind, when it sees a nation's flag, sees not the flag only, but the nation itself. And whatever may be its symbols, its insignia, he reads chiefly in the flag the government, the principles, the truths, the history, which belong to the nation which sets it forth. When the French tricolor rolls out to the wind, we see France. When the new-found Italian flag is unfurled, we see resurrected Italy. When the other three-cornered Hungarian flag shall be lifted to the wind, we shall see in it the long-buried but never-dead principles of Hungarian liberty. When the united crosses of St. Andrew and St. George on a fiery ground set forth the banner of Old England, we see not the cloth merely. There rises up before the mind the noble aspect of that monarchy, which, more than any other on the globe, has advanced its banner for liberty, law, and national prosperity. This nation has a banner too, and whenever it is streamed abroad, men see daybreak bursting on their eyes, for the American flag has been the symbol of liberty, and men rejoice in it. Not another flag on the globe had such an errand, or went forth upon the sea carrying everywhere, the world around, such hope for the captive, and such glorious tidings. The stars upon it were to the pining nations like the morning stars of God, and the stripes upon it were beams of morning light. As at early dawn the stars stand first, and then it grows light, and then as the sun advances, that light breaks into banks and streaming lines of color, the glowing red and intense white striving together, and ribbing the horizon with bars effulgent. So on the American flag, stars and beams of many-colored light shine out together. And wherever the flag comes and men behold it, they see in its sacred emblazonry no rampant lion or fierce eagle, but only light, and every fold significant of liberty. The history of this banner is all on one side. Under it rode Washington and his armies. Before it, Burgoyne laid down his arms. It waved on the highlands at West Point. It floated over old Fort Montgomery. When Arnold would have surrendered these valuable fortresses and precious legacies, his night was turned into day, and his treason was driven away by the beams of light from this starry banner. It cheered our army, driven from New York, in their solitary pilgrimage through New Jersey. It streamed in light over Valley Forge and Morristown. It crossed the waters rolling with ice at Trenton, and when its stars gleamed in the cold morning with victory, a new day of hope dawned on the despondency of the nation. And when, at length, the long years of war were drawn to a close, underneath the folds of this immortal banner sat Washington, while Yorktown surrendered its hosts, and our revolutionary struggles ended with victory. Let us then twine each thread of the glorious tissue of our nation's flag about our heartstrings, and looking upon our homes and catching the spirit that breathes upon us from the battlefields of our fathers, let us resolve, come weal or woe, we will, in life and in death, now and forever, stand by the Stars and Stripes. They have been unfurled from the snows of Canada to the plains of New Orleans, in the halls of Montezuma's, and amid the solitude of every sea, and everywhere as the luminous symbol of resistless and beneficent power. They have led the brave to victory and to glory. They have floated over our cradles. Let it be our prayer and our struggle that they shall float over our graves. The End of The American Flag by Henry Ward Beecher.
The Decline of the Drama by Stephen Leacock. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Peter Thomlinson. Coming up home the other night in my car, the Guy Street car, I heard a man who was hanging onto a strap say, "The drama is just turning into a bunch of talk." This set me thinking, and I was glad that it did, because I am being paid by this paper to think once a week, and it is wearing. Some days I never think from morning till night. The decline of the drama is a thing of which I feel deeply and bitterly, for I am, or I have been, something of an actor myself. I've only been in amateur work, I admit, but still I have played some mighty interesting parts. I've acted in Shakespeare as a citizen. I have been a fairy in A Midsummer Night's Dream, and I was once one end, choice of ends, of a camel in a pantomime. I have had other parts too, such as A Voice Speaks from Within, or A Noise is Heard Without, or A Bell Rings from Behind, and a lot of things like that. I played as a noise for 7 nights before crowded houses where people were being turned away from the door, and I've been a groan and a sigh and a tumult, and once I was a vision passes before the sleeper. So when I talk of acting and of the spirit of the drama, I speak of what I know. Naturally, too, I was brought into contact very often, into quite intimate personal contact, with some of the greatest actors of the day. I don't say it in any way of boasting, but merely because of those of us who love the stage, all dramatic souvenirs are interesting. I remember, for example, that when Wilson Barrett played the Bat and had to wear the queer suit with the scales, it was I who put the glue on him. And I recall a conversation with Sir Henry Irving one night when he said to me, "Fetch me a glass of water, will you?" And I said, "Sir Henry, it is not only a pleasure to get it, but it is, to me, as a humble devotee of the art that you have ennobled, a high privilege. I will go further." "Do," he said. Henry was like that, quick, sympathetic, what we call in French, vibrant. Forbes Robertson I shall never forget. He owes me 50 cents. And as for Martin Harvey, I simply cannot call him Sir John. We are such dear old friends. He never comes to this town without at once calling in my services to lend a hand in his production. No doubt everybody knows that splendid play in which he appears, called The Breed of the Treshams. There is a torture scene in it, a most gruesome thing. Harvey, as the hero, has to be tortured, not on the stage itself, but off the stage in a little room at the side. You can hear him howling as he is tortured. Well, it was I who was torturing him. We were so used to working together that Harvey didn't want to let anybody do it but me. So naturally I am a keen friend and student of the drama, and I hate to think of it going all to pieces. The trouble with it is that it is becoming a mere mass of conversation and reflection. Nothing happens in it. The action is all going out of it, and there is nothing left but thought. When actors begin to think, it is time for a change. They are not fitted for it. Now in my day, I mean when I was at the apogee of my reputation, I think that is the word, it may be apology, I forget. Things were very different. What we wanted was action, striking, climatic, catastrophic action, in which things not only happened, but happened suddenly and all in a lump. And we always took care that the action happened in some place that was worthwhile, not simply in an ordinary room with ordinary furniture, the way it is in the new drama. The scene was laid in a lighthouse, top story, or in a madhouse at midnight, or in a powerhouse, or a doghouse, or a bathhouse. In short, in some place with a distinct local colour and atmosphere. I remember in the case of the first play I ever wrote, I write plays too, the manager to whom I submitted it asked me at once, the moment he glanced at it, "Where is the action of this laid?" "It is laid," I answered, "in the main sewer of a great city." "Good, good," he said. "Keep it there." In the case of another play, the manager said to me, "What are you doing for atmosphere?" "The opening act," I said, "is in a steam laundry." "Very good," he answered as he turned over the pages. "And have you brought in a condemned cell?" I told him that I had not. "That's rather unfortunate," he said, "because we are especially anxious to bring in a condemned cell. 3 of the big theatres have got them this season, and I think we ought to have it in. Can you do it?" "Yes," I said, "I can, if it's wanted. I'll look through the cast, and no doubt I can find one at least of them that ought to be put to death." "Yes, yes," said the manager enthusiastically. "I am sure you can. But I think of all the settings that we used, the lighthouse plays were the best. There is something about a lighthouse that you don't get in a modern drawing room. What it is, I don't know, but there's a difference. I always have liked a lighthouse play, and never have enjoyed acting so much, have never thrown myself into acting so deeply as in a play of that sort. There is something about a lighthouse, the way you see it in the earlier scenes, with the lantern shining out over the black waters, that suggests security, fidelity, faithfulness to a trust. The stage used generally to be dim in the first part of a lighthouse play, and you could see the huddled figures of the fishermen and their wives on the foreshore, pointing out to the sea, the back of the stage. "See," one cried, with his arm extended, "there is lightning in yon sky." I was the lightning, and that my cue for it. "God help all the poor souls at sea tonight." Then a woman cried, "Look, look, a boat upon the reef!" And as she said it, I had to rush round and work the boat to make it go up and down properly. Then there was more lightning, and someone screamed out, "Look, see, there's a woman in the boat!" There wasn't really, it was me, but in the darkness it was all the same, and of course the heroine herself couldn't be there yet, because she had to be downstairs getting dressed to be drowned. Then they all cried out, "Poor soul, she's doomed!" and all the fishermen ran up and down making a noise. Fishermen in those plays used to get fearfully excited, and what with the excitement and the darkness and the bright beams of the lighthouse falling on the wet oilskins and the thundering of the sea upon the reef, ah, me, those were plays. That was acting. And to think that there isn't a single streak of lightning in any play on the boards this year. And then the kind of climax that a play like this used to have. The scene shifted right at the moment of the excitement, and lo, we are in the tower, the top story of the lighthouse, interior scene. And all is still and quiet within, with the bright light of the reflectors flooding the little room, and the roar of the storm heard like muffled thunder outside. The lighthouse keeper trims his lamps. How firm and quiet and rugged he looks. The snows of 60 winters are on his head, but his eye is clear and his grip strong. Hear the howl of the wind as he opens the door and steps forth upon the iron balcony, 80 feet above the water, and peers out upon the storm. "God pity all the poor souls at sea," he says. They all say that. If you get used to it and get to like it, you want to hear it said, no matter how often they say it. The waves raged beneath him. I threw it at him, really, but the effect was wonderful. And then, as he comes in from the storm to the still room, the climax breaks. A man staggers into the room in oilskins, drenched, wet, breathless. They all stagger in these plays, and in the new drama they walk, and the effect is feebleness itself. He points to the sea. A boat upon the reef, with a woman in it. And the lighthouse keeper knows that it is his only daughter, the only one that he has, who is being cast to death upon the reef. Then comes the dilemma. They want him for the lifeboat. No one can take it through the surf but him. You know that because the other man says so himself. But if he goes in the boat, then the great light will go out. Untended, it cannot live in the storm. And if it goes out, if it goes out, ask of the angry waves and the resounding rocks of what tonight's long toll of death must be without the light. I wish you could have seen it, you who only see the drawing-room plays of today, the scene when the lighthouse man draws himself up, calm and resolute, and says, "My place is here, God's will be done." And you know that as he says it and turns quietly to his lamp again, the boat is drifting, at that very moment, to the rocks. How did they save her? My dear sir, if you can ask that question, you little understand the drama as it was. Save her? No, of course they didn't save her. What we wanted in the old drama was reality and force, no matter how wild and tragic it might be. They did not save her. They found her the next day in the concluding scene, all that was left of her when she was dashed upon the rocks. Her ribs were broken, her bottom boards had been smashed in, her gunwale was gone. In short, she was a wreck. The girl? Oh yes, certainly they saved the girl. That kind of thing was always taken care of. You see, just as the lighthouse man said, God's will be done, his eye fell on a long coil of rope hanging there. Providential, wasn't it? But then we were not ashamed to use providence in the old drama. So he made a noose in it and threw it over the balcony and hauled the girl up on it. I used to hook her onto it every night. A rotten play? Oh, I'm sure it must have been. But somehow, those of us who were brought up on that sort of thing still sigh for it. End of The Decline of the Drama by Stephen Leacock. Recording by Peter Thomlinson.
Did Betsy Ross Design the Flag of the United States of America? By Franklin Hanford. A paper read before the Scottsville Literary Society, January 22, 1917. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Did Betsy Ross Design the Flag of the United States of America? By Franklin Hanford. On Saturday, the 14th of June, 1777, the Continental Congress, then in session in Philadelphia, adopted a resolution which reads as follows: Resolved, that the flag of the 13 United States be 13 stripes, alternate red and white, that the Union be 13 stars, white in a blue field representing a new constellation. The Journal of Congress is silent as to the name of the member or committee that introduced this resolution, and neither is there any record of the discussions that may have preceded the adoption of our national emblem. It is a matter of great regret that no record of the circumstances attending the birth of the Stars and Stripes has ever been found, for we should like to know who designed our present flag, and also, though a matter of less interest, who made, that is, manufactured, the first one. Some years ago I happened to see upon the wall at Mrs. Emma H. Miller's house in Scottsville a very attractive picture in colors. This picture represented General Washington seated on the left, and Robert Morris and the Honorable George Ross standing near him, while seated on the right was Betsy Ross with a completed flag of 13 stripes and 13 stars in a blue field, in her lap. C. H. Weisberger, copyright 1903, was inscribed near the bottom of the picture. Underneath it was this legend: Birth of our nation's flag. The first American flag accepted by Congress and adopted by resolution of Congress June 14, 1777, as the national standard was made by Betsy Ross in 1776 at 239 Arch Street, Philadelphia, in the room represented in this picture. The committee, Robert Morris and Hon. George Ross, accompanied by General George Washington, called upon this celebrated woman and together with her suggestions produced our beautiful emblem of liberty." End quote. The legend under this picture led me to make some inquiries as to Betsy Ross. Who was she? And did she assist in designing and did she make the first flag or ensign of the United States of America? If not Betsy Ross, who did design and make it? Endeavoring to answer these questions, I have consulted some 13 works relating wholly or in part to the flag of the United States. A list of them is appended to this paper. Betsy, or Elizabeth, Griscom was the fifth daughter of Samuel and Rebecca (née James) Griscom, and was born January 1, 1752. She was married when quite young to John Ross, son of the Reverend Aeneas Ross, an Episcopal clergyman of Newcastle, Delaware, whose brother, the Honorable George Ross, became one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. George Ross was interested in the furnishing of cannon balls, with perhaps other military stores for the Continental defense, and was well on guard at night over these, with other young men, that the nephew, John Ross, Betsy's first husband, received an injury from the effects of which he died in January 1776. It was during her widowhood that Betsy Ross is said to have made the first Stars and Stripes. For a second husband she married a sea captain, John or Joseph Ashburn, who died in Mill Prison, England, in 1782. The following year she married Ashburn's prison mate, John Claypool, who died in 1817. Betsy Ross died in her daughter's home in Philadelphia, January 30, 1836, aged 84. She was buried in the cemetery of the Society of Free Quakers on South Fifth Street, from which place her remains were transferred in 1857 to Mount Moriah Cemetery. 4 of her daughters grew up and married. Betsy Ross's first husband was an upholsterer. She continued his business and for 50 years was an expert needlewoman, lace-maker, and flag-maker. After her death, Mrs. Clarissa Wilson, one of her daughters, succeeded to the business and continued to make flags for the arsenals and navy yards and for the mercantile marine for many years. But being conscientious on the subject of war, Mrs. Wilson gave up the government business, but continued to make flags for the merchant marine until 1857. The earliest history of the national flag of which I have knowledge was written by Captain Schuyler Hamilton, U.S. Army, and published in Philadelphia in 1853, 64 years ago. Captain Hamilton makes no mention of Betsy Ross and does not give to any one person or group of persons the honor of designing our flag. The next History of Our Flag was written by Ferdinand L. Sarmiento and published in 1864 during the Civil War in Philadelphia. Sarmiento, like Captain Hamilton, does not mention Betsy Ross and does not credit the origin of our flag to any one person or to any committee or group of persons, but considers honor due to many individuals who assisted more or less in the development of our flag. So far as I can learn, no mention of Mrs. Ross occurs in any history of our country or any of the many biographies of Washington prior to 1870, 93 years after the flag was adopted. In that year, however, quote, Mr. William J. Canby of Philadelphia read before the Historical Society of Pennsylvania a paper on the history of the American flag, in which he stated that his maternal grandmother, Mrs. John Ross, was the first maker and partial designer of the Stars and Stripes, end quote. Mr. Canby said that Mrs. Ross received a call in June 1776 from General Washington, Colonel George Ross, and Robert Morris, who told her they were in a committee of Congress and wanted her to make a flag from a rough drawing they had, which drawing, upon her suggestion, was redrawn by Washington in pencil. This was prior to the Declaration of Independence. Mr. Canby claimed that he had heard his grandmother tell the story when he was a boy 11 years old, and that 3 of Mrs. Ross's daughters, then living in 1870, and a niece, aged 95, confirmed his statements. In the picture I've referred to, Mrs. Ross is represented as having a completed Stars and Stripes in her lap, although at the time of the visit of the committee to her, according to Mr. Canby's statement, the flag had not even been designed or manufactured. The best and most complete history of the flag of the U.S. of America was written by Rear Admiral George H. Preble, U.S. Navy. The first edition was published in 1872 and the second revised edition in 1880. Rear Admiral Preble gives Mr. Canby's story about Mrs. Ross in full, and he considers it probable that Mrs. Ross did manufacture or have manufactured at different times flags of the United States of various designs. His conclusion, however, is that, quote, "It will probably never be known who designed our Union of Stars, the records of Congress being silent on the subject, and there being no mention or suggestion of it in any of the voluminous correspondence or diaries of the time, public or private, which have ever been published." End quote. In 1878, a ridiculous pamphlet was published entitled "The History of the First United States Flag and the Patriotism of Betsy Ross, the Immortal Heroine that Originated the First Flag of the Union, dedicated to the Ladies of the United States by Colonel J. Franklin Reigart." End quote. This was published at Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. In Reigart's book, the claim is made that Mrs. Ross originated our flag. Mr. Canby, Mrs. Ross's grandson, had claimed only that she manufactured it and that she suggested some changes in the sketch shown her by the committee. In Reigart's book, there is a pretended portrait of Betsy Ross making the first flag. This was really the portrait of a Quaker lady of Lancaster and was taken from a photograph. Mr. Canby repudiated Reigart's book and said that he did not correctly present his grandmother nor her claim. In 1876, Mr. J.C. Julius Langbein wrote a small history of our flag, and he accepts Mr. Canby's account of Mrs. Ross making the first flag and suggesting some change in the original design. Learning that a book entitled Betsy Ross had been published in 1901, I procured a copy thinking it biographical or historical, but it proved to be a romance, pure and simple, woven about Mrs. Ross, who was represented as the heroine of her day and the principal designer of the flag. Since 1891, several small works on the flag have been published, written by members of the Daughters of the American Revolution and dedicated to that organization. In those works, great honor is given to Mrs. Ross. Indeed, the members of the DAR as a whole seem to have accepted Mr. Canby's story as beyond dispute. In 1908, Mr. John H. Foe published at Philadelphia a book of 54 pages entitled The True Story of the American Flag. Mr. Foe devotes considerable space to the claims made for Mrs. Ross and considers them without any documentary or record proof. He says, quote, "If Mrs. Ross made a flag in an Arch Street house as claimed, it was made after a design that had been conceived and born somewhere else, and her contribution was no more than the labor that is given by any girl or woman in a flag manufactory. Even according to the paper which was read by Mr. Canby before the Historical Society in 1870, it is admitted that a design made by someone else was taken to her, but that she made some changes in it. Now," says Mr. Foe, "that is all there is in the Betsy Ross claim. Yet the growing youths of the nation are being misled and taught an historical untruth. Mr. Foe also says that the Canby claim, quote, is practically charging Washington and the rest of the committee with seeking to establish and set up in June 1776 a national ensign before we had declared ourselves a free people on July 4th of the same year, and without any delegated authority to do so, the record of Congress being silent on the subject, end quote. I will not quote further from Mr. Foe's book, as to do so would unduly lengthen this paper, but the book itself can be found in the Scottsville Free Library. I have lately found in the Manual of Patriotism for Use in the Public Schools of the State of New York, edition of 1904, compiled, arranged, and edited under direction of Charles H. Skinner, State Superintendent of Public Instruction, end quote, the following in relation to the origin of our flag. Quote, a committee of Congress accompanied by Washington sought out the home and services of Mrs. Elizabeth Ross of Philadelphia, better known as Betsy Ross, to aid them in the flag making. Her skillful hands and willing heart soon worked out a plan and gave to this country that red, white, and blue banner which is the admiration of all nations and the unfailing joy of every true American, end quote. All of which is a very fine example of what may be called patriotic gush. Here you observe that Mr. Skinner gives Mrs. Ross all the credit for working out and giving us the flag. As it seemed to me that that sort of history and patriotism is all wrong, and as there is, I believe, no warrant for that statement, I wrote on September 16, 1916, to the State Superintendent of Public Instruction at Albany, and asked to be furnished with the authority upon which that statement was based. A reply came very promptly signed, Wilmer L. Hall, Sublibrarian in History, to whom my letter had been referred for reply. Mr. Hall says, the statement you quote may be based upon one or more of the several histories of the American flag. For example, Peleg D. Harrison, The Stars and Stripes, 5th edition, 1914, and C.W. Stewart, The Stars and Stripes, 1915. These accounts do not assert that Betsy Ross originated the American flag, but allow her the credit for making the first one. It is said that Congress appointed a committee consisting of General Washington, Colonel George Ross, and Robert Morris, who called upon Mrs. Ross and submitted to her a rough drawing of the flag. As the American flag is a growth rather than a creation, its exact origin is not determined, nor is the date of the manufacture of the first one by Mrs. Ross and the date of its first use matters of exact knowledge. Upon examining the two works referred to by Mr. Hall, I find that Mr. Harrison says that, quote, the credit of making the first flag combining the Stars and Stripes is generally given to Mrs. Betsy Ross, and the story of its making is somewhat familiar to all, end quote. Then Mr. Harrison goes on to give Mr. Canby's account of what his grandmother told him. Mr. Stewart, in his book, says, tradition tells us that Mrs. Elizabeth Ross, known as Betsy Ross, of Philadelphia, constructed the first Stars and Stripes flag. Though we have no official record of the making of this first United States flag, the accounts given by Betsy Ross's relatives are generally accepted, end quote. I will here call attention to the use by Mr. Hall, Mr. Harrison, Mr. Stewart, and other writers of such expressions as, it is said, tradition tells us, it is believed, credit is generally given, and so forth and so forth. These expressions are to history what the expression they say in common gossip or talk is to the truth, and are worth just as much. The fact that a thing is generally believed does not make it true. Sometime after the receipt of the foregoing letter from Mr. Hall, I wrote him suggesting that the account given on page 5 of the Manual of Patriotism, previously quoted, be corrected to agree with the facts. It will be noted from the above correspondence that the State Department of Instruction does not now assert, as it did in 1904, that Betsy Ross originated the design of the flag for the United States. What became of the flag that Betsy Ross is said to have made in June 1776? In all the engagements that took place between the American and British troops from June 1776 to August 1777, there is no record in existence, public or private, that the flag claimed to have been designed by Mrs. Ross in June 1776 was carried. The first time that the Stars and Stripes was carried by American troops was at the Battle of the Brandywine, September 1777. The annals of the American Congress do not say that any committee was appointed to design the flag. Washington made no note of a visit to Mrs. Ross's house, although he was a voluminous letter writer and kept most detailed diaries, and his writings do not contain a word that suggests when the first United States flag was made or designed. Neither do any of the distinguished historians of the Revolutionary period give us light on this question. Newspapers of Philadelphia issued at that time do not chronicle any portion of the story as told by Mr. Canby 93 years after the flag was adopted by Congress. Mrs. Ross did make state colors for vessels and batteries prior to June 14, 1777, but it was not until after the Stars and Stripes were ordained that she became a government flag maker. The Betsy Ross legend has grown up since 1870 entirely from her grandson's statement as to what he and other descendants had heard her say. This legend is now generally believed and taught in our schools as history. The people of our country are very apt at setting up idols of one kind or another and at manufacturing heroes and heroines. That Betsy Ross was a good woman and an industrious and competent seamstress is entirely probable. That she was brave, we may believe. She married 3 husbands. At all events, we now have Betsy Ross chapters, Betsy Ross auxiliaries, and Betsy Ross this and that and the other. And her former home at 239 Arch Street in Philadelphia has been bought and is preserved by the American Flag House and Betsy Ross Memorial Association. And a large sign across the front reads, Birthplace of Old Glory. Now, with your permission, I will give you my own conclusions on the subject. The evidence that General Washington, Robert Morris, and Colonel George Ross called upon Mrs. Ross in June 1776 and asked her to make a flag from a sketch which they showed her, that Mrs. Ross suggested alterations in the design, which the committee accepted, and that she made a flag from the modified design, which flag was a year later adopted by Congress as our national ensign, is entirely hearsay evidence. It is based solely on statements by Betsy Ross's descendants as to what they heard her say. This evidence, I think, would not be accepted in a court of law, and therefore it is not proved that Mrs. Ross either designed nor manufactured our first flag. I read a portion of this paper on June 14, 1912, before the Caledonia chapter of the DAR, and asked them this question. Would you admit to membership in your society a person whose sole claim to membership was based on what she had heard her grandmother say? The unanimous reply was that they could not admit such a claimant. Possibly there may be some better evidence than I've been able to find to substantiate the claims made for Betsy Ross, but until such evidence is produced, then the people of our country should be taught the facts of the case and not a legend as a fact. The answer, then, to the question propounded at the beginning of this paper is that Betsy Ross did not design the flag of the United States of America. And Did Betsy Ross design the flag of the United States of America? By Franklin Hanford.
Sermon number 73 by Charles Spurgeon, entitled Effectual Calling, delivered on Sabbath morning, March 30th, 1856, at New Park Street Chapel, Southwark. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is narrated by Leighton Garner in January 2018, Panama City, Panama. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and saw him, and said unto him, Zacchaeus, make haste, and come down, For today I must abide at thy house. Luke 19:5. Notwithstanding our firm belief that you are, in the main, well instructed in the doctrines of the everlasting gospel, we are continually reminded in our conversation with young converts how absolutely necessary it is to repeat our former lessons and repeatedly assert and prove over and over again those doctrines which lie at the basis of our holy religion. Our friends, therefore, who have many years ago been taught the great doctrine of effectual calling, will believe that whilst I preach very simply this morning, the sermon is intended for those who are young in the fear of the Lord, that they may better understand this great starting point of God in the heart, the effectual calling of men by the Holy Spirit. I shall use the case of Zacchaeus as a great illustration of the doctrine of effectual calling. You will remember the story. Zacchaeus had a curiosity to see the wonderful man, Jesus Christ, who was turning the world upside down and causing an immense excitement in the minds of men. We sometimes find fault with curiosity and say it is sinful to come to the house of God from that motive. I am not quite sure that we should hazard such an assertion. The motive is not sinful, though certainly it is not virtuous. Yet it has often been proved that curiosity is one of the best allies of grace. Zacchaeus, moved by this motive, desired to see Christ, but there were two obstacles in the way. First, there was such a crowd of people that he could not get near the Savior. And again, he was so exceedingly short in stature that there was no hope of his reaching over people's heads to catch a glimpse of him. What did he do? He did as the boys were doing, for the boys of old times were no doubt just like the boys of the present age, and were perched up in the boughs of the tree to look at Jesus as he passed along. Elderly man though he is, Zacchaeus jumps up, and there he sits among the children. The boys are too much afraid of that stern old publican, whom their fathers dreaded, to push him down or cause him any inconvenience. See him there. With what anxiety he is peeping down to see which is Christ. For the Savior had no pompous distinction. No beadle is walking before him with a silver mace. He did not hold a golden crozier in his hand. He had no pontifical dress. In fact, he was just dressed like those around him. He had a coat like that of a common peasant, made of one piece from top to bottom, and Zacchaeus could scarcely distinguish him. However, before he has caught a sight of Christ, Christ has fixed his eye upon him, and standing under the tree, he looks up and says, Zacchaeus, make haste, and come down, for today I must abide at thy house. Down comes Zacchaeus. Christ goes to his house. Zacchaeus becomes Christ's follower, and enters into the kingdom of heaven. Now, first, effectual calling is a very gracious truth. You may guess this from the fact that Zacchaeus was a character whom we should suppose the last to be saved. He belonged to a bad city, Jericho, a city which had been cursed, and no one would suspect that anyone would come out of Jericho to be saved. It was near Jericho that the man fell among thieves. We trust Zacchaeus had no hand in it, but there are some who, while they are publicans, can be thieves also. We might as well expect converts from St. Giles, or the lowest parts of London, from the worst and vilest dens of infamy, as from Jericho in those days. Ah, my brethren, it matters not where you come from. You may come from one of the dirtiest streets, one of the worst back slums in London, but if effectual grace call you, it is an effectual call, which knoweth no distinction of place. Zacchaeus also was of an exceedingly bad trade, and probably cheated the people in order to enrich himself. Indeed, when Christ went into his house, there was a universal murmur that he had gone to be a guest with a man that was a sinner. But, my brethren, grace knows no distinction. It is no respecter of persons. But God calleth whom he wills, and he called this worst of publicans, in the worst of cities, from the worst of trades. Besides, Zacchaeus was one who was the least likely to be saved because he was rich. It is true, rich and poor are welcome. No one has the least excuse for despair because of his condition. Yet it is a fact that not many great men after the flesh, not many mighty, are called. But God has chosen the poor of the world, rich in faith. But grace knows no distinction here. The rich Zacchaeus is called from the tree. Down he comes, and he is saved. I have thought it one of the greatest instances of God's condescension, that he can look down on man. But I will tell you that there was a greater condescension than that when Christ looked up to see Zacchaeus. For God to look down on his creatures, that is mercy. But for Christ so to humble himself that he has to look up to one of his own creatures, that becomes mercy indeed. Ah, many of you have climbed up the tree of your own good works, and perched yourself in the branches of your holy actions, and are trusting in the free will of the poor creature, or resting in some worldly maxim. Nevertheless, Christ looks up even to proud sinners, and calls them down. Come down, says he. Today I must abide in thy house. Had Zacchaeus been a humble-minded man, sitting by the wayside, or at the feet of Christ, we should then have admired Christ's mercy. But here he is, lifted up, and Christ looks up to him, and bids him come down. Next, it was a personal call. There were boys in the tree, as well as Zacchaeus, but there was no mistake about the person who was called. It was Zacchaeus. Make haste and come down. There are other calls mentioned in Scripture. It is said, especially, many are called, but few are chosen. Now that is not the effectual call which is intended by the apostle, when he said, Whom he called, them he also justified. That is a general call which many men, yea, all men reject, unless there come after it the personal, particular call which makes us Christians. You will bear me witness that it was a personal call that brought you to the Savior. It was some sermon which led you to feel that you were, no doubt, the person intended. The text, perhaps, was Thou, God, seest me, and the minister laid particular stress on the word me, so that you thought God's eye was fixed upon you, and ere the sermon was concluded, you thought you saw God open the books to condemn you, and your heart whispered, Can any hide himself in secret places that I shall not see him, saith the Lord? You might have been perched in the window, or stood packed in the aisle, but you had a solemn conviction that the sermon was preached to you, and not to other people. God does not call his people in shoals, but in units. Jesus saith unto her, Mary, and she turned and said unto him, Rabboni, which is to say, Master. Jesus seeth Peter and John fishing by the lake, and he saith unto them, Follow me. He seeth Matthew sitting at the table at the receipt of custom, and he saith unto him, Arise and follow me. And Matthew did so. When the Holy Ghost comes home to a man, God's arrow goes into his heart. It does not graze his helmet, or make some little mark upon his armor, but it penetrates between the joints of the harness, entering the marrow of the soul. Have you felt, dear friends, that personal call? Do you remember when a voice said, Arise, he calleth thee? Can you look back to some time when you said, My Lord, my God, when you knew the Spirit was striving with you, and you said, Lord, I come to thee, for I know that thou callest me. I might call the whole of you throughout eternity, but if God call one, there will be more effect through his personal call of one than my general call of multitudes. Thirdly, it's a hastening call. Zacchaeus, make haste. The sinner, when he is called by the ordinary ministry, replies, Tomorrow. He hears a telling sermon, and he said, I will turn to God by and by. The tears roll down his cheek, but they are wiped away. Some goodness appears, but like the cloud of the morning, it is dissipated by the sun of temptation. He says, I solemnly vow from this time to be a reformed man. After I have once more indulged in my darling sin, I will renounce my lusts and decide for God. Ah, that is only a minister's call, and is good for nothing. Hell, they say, is paved with good intentions. These good intentions are begotten by general calls. The road to perdition is laid all over with branches of trees whereon men are sitting. For they often pull down branches from the trees, but they do not come down themselves. The straw laid down before a sick man's door causes the wheels to roll more noiselessly. So there be some who strew their path with promises of repentance, and so go more easily and noiselessly down to perdition. But God's call is not a call for tomorrow. Today, if you will hear his voice, harden not your hearts, as in the provocation when your fathers tempted me. God's grace always comes with dispatch, and if thou art drawn by God, thou wilt run after God, and not be talking about delays. Tomorrow, it is not written in the almanac of time. Tomorrow, it is Satan's calendar and nowhere else. Tomorrow, it is a rock whitened by the bones of mariners who have been wrecked upon it. It is the wrecker's light gleaming on the shore, luring poor ships to destruction. Tomorrow, it is the idiot's cup, which he fableth to lie at the foot of the rainbow, but which none hath ever found. Tomorrow, it is the floating island of Loch Lomond, which none hath ever seen. Tomorrow, it is a dream. Tomorrow, it is a delusion. Tomorrow, aye, tomorrow you may lift up your eyes in hell, being in torments. Yonder clock saith today, everything crieth today, and the Holy Ghost is in union with these things, and saith, Today, if you will hear his voice, harden not your hearts. Sinners, are you inclined now to seek the Savior? Are you breathing a prayer now? Are you saying, now or never? I must be saved now? If you are, then I hope it is an effectual call. For Christ, when he giveth an effectual call, says, Zacchaeus, make haste. Next it is a humbling call. Zacchaeus, make haste and come down. Many a time hath a minister called men to repentance, with a call which has made them proud, exalted them in their own esteem, and led them to say, I can turn to God when I like. I can do so without the influence of the Holy Ghost. They have been called to go up and not to come down. God always humbles the sinner. Can I not remember when God told me to come down? One of the first steps I had to take was to go right down from my good works, and oh, what a fall was that. I have pulled you down from your good works, and now I will pull you down from your self-sufficiency. Well, I had another fall, and I felt sure I had gained the bottom. But Christ said, Come down, and he made me come down till I fell on some point at which I felt I was yet solvable. Down, sir, come down yet. And down I came until I had to let go every bough of the tree of my hopes and despair. And then I said, I can do nothing. I am ruined. The waters were wrapped around my head, and I was shut out from the light of day, and thought myself a stranger from the commonwealth of Israel. Come down lower yet, sir. Thou hast too much pride to be saved. Then I was brought down to see my corruption, my wickedness, my filthiness. Come down, says God, when he means to save. Now, proud sinners, it is of no use for you to be proud, to stick yourself up in the trees. Christ will have you down. O thou that dwellest with the eagle on the craggy rock, thou shalt come down from thy elevation. Thou shalt fall by grace, or thou shalt fall with a vengeance one day. He hath cast down the mighty from their seat, and hath exalted the humble and meek. Next, it is an affectionate call. Today I must abide in thy house. You can easily conceive how the faces of the multitude change. They thought Christ to be the holiest and best of men, and were ready to make him a king. But he says, Today I must abide in thy house. There was one poor Jew who had been inside Zacchaeus' house. He had been on the carpet, as they say in country villages when they are taken before the justice. And he recollected what sort of house it was. He remembered how he was taken in there, and his conceptions of it were something like what a fly would have of a spider's den after he had once escaped. There was another who had been distrained of nearly all his property, and the idea he had of walking in there was like walking into the den of lions. What said they? Is this holy man going into such a den as that, where we poor wretches have been robbed and ill-treated? It was bad enough for Christ to speak to him up in the tree, but the idea of going into his house? They all murmured at his going to be a guest with a man who was a sinner. Well, I know what some of the disciples thought. They thought it very imprudent. It might injure his character, and he might offend the people. They thought he might have gone to see this man night, like Nicodemus, and give him an audience when nobody saw him. But publicly, to acknowledge such a man was the most imprudent act he could commit. But why did Christ do as he did? Because he would give Zacchaeus an affectionate call. I will not come and stand at thy threshold, or look in at thy window, but I will come unto thine house, the same house where the cries of widows have come into thine ears, and thou hast disregarded them. I will come into thy parlor, where the weeping of the orphan have never moved thy compassion. I will come there, where thou, like a ravenous lion, hast devoured thy prey. I will come there, where thou hast blackened thine house, and made it infamous. I will come into the place where cries have risen to high heaven, wrung from the lips of those whom thou hast oppressed. I will come into thy house and give thee a blessing. Oh, what affection there was in that! Poor sinner, my master is a very affectionate master. He will come into your house. What kind of a house have you got? A house that you have made miserable with your drunkenness? A house that you have defiled with your impurity? A house you have defiled with your cursing and swearing? A house where you are carrying on an ill trade that you would be glad to get rid of? Christ say, I will come into thine house. And I know some houses now that once were dens of sin, where Christ comes every morning. The husband and wife who once could quarrel and fight, bend their knees together in prayer. Some of my hearers can scarce come for an hour to their meals, but they must have a word of prayer and reading of the Scriptures. Christ comes to them. Where the walls were plastered up with a lascivious song and idle picture, there is a Christian almanac in one place. There is a Bible on the chest of drawers. And though it is only one room they live in, if an angel should come in, and God should say, What hast thou seen in this house? He would say, I have seen good furniture, for there is a Bible there. Here and there a religious book. The filthy pictures are pulled down and burned. There are no cards in the man's cupboard now. Christ has come into his house. Oh, what a blessing that we have our household God, as well as the Romans. Our God is a household God. He comes to live with his people. He loves the tents of Jacob. Now, poor ragamuffin sinner, thou who livest in the filthiest den in London, if such a one be here, Jesus saith to thee, Zacchaeus, make haste and come down, for today I must abide in thy house. Again, it was not only an affectionate call, but it was an abiding call. Today I must abide at thy house. A common call is like this. Today I shall walk in at thy house, at one door, and out the other. The common call, which is given by the gospel to all men, is a call which operates upon them for a time. Then it is all over. But the saving call is an abiding call. When Christ speaks, he does not say, Make haste, Zacchaeus, and come down, for I am just coming to look in. But I must abide in thy house. I am coming to sit down to eat and drink with thee. I am coming to have a meal with thee. Today I must abide in thy house. Ah, says one, you cannot tell how many times I have been impressed, sir. I have often had a series of solemn convictions. And I thought I really was saved. But it all died away, like a dream when one awaketh. All had vanished that he dreamed. So was it with me. Ah, but poor soul, do not despair. Dost thou feel the strivings of almighty grace within thy heart, bidding thee repent today? If thou dost, it will be an abiding call. If it is Jesus at work in thy soul, he will come and tarry in thine heart, and consecrate thee for his own forever. He says, I will come and dwell with thee, and that forever. I will come and say, Here I will make my settled rest. No more will go and come, no more a stranger or a guest, but master of this home. Oh, say you, that is what I want. I want an abiding call, something that will last. I do not want a religion that will wash out, but a fast color religion. Well, that is the kind of call Christ gives. His ministers cannot give it, but when Christ speaks, he speaks with power. He says, Zacchaeus, make haste and come down, for today I must abide at thy house. There is one thing, however, I cannot forget, and that is that it was a necessary call. Just read it over again. Zacchaeus, make haste and come down, for today I must abide at thy house. It was not a thing that he might do or might not do, but it was a necessary call. The salvation of a sinner is as much a matter of necessity with God as the fulfillment of his covenant, that the rain shall no more drown the world. The salvation of every blood-bought child of God is a necessary thing for 3 reasons. It is necessary because it is God's purpose. It is necessary because it is Christ's purchase. It is necessary because it is God's promise. It is necessary that the child of God should be saved. Some divines think it is very wrong to lay a stress on the word must, especially in that passage where it is said, he must needs go through Samaria. Why, they say, he must needs go through Samaria because there was no other way he could go, and therefore he was forced to go that way. Yes, gentlemen, we reply, no doubt, but then there might have been another way. Providence made it so that he must needs go through Samaria, and that Samaria should lie in the route he had chosen, so that we have you anyway. He must needs go through Samaria. Providence directed man to build Samaria directly in the road, and grace constrained the Savior to move in that direction. It was not, come down, Zacchaeus, because I may abide at thy house. But I must. The Savior felt a strong necessity, just as much a necessity as there is that man should die, as stern a necessity as there is that the sun should give us light by day and the moon by night. Just so much a necessity is there that every blood-bought child of God shall be saved. Today I must abide at thy house. And oh, when the Lord comes to this, that he must and he will, what a thing it is with the poor sinner then. At other times we ask, shall I let him in at all? There is a stranger at the door. He is knocking now. He has knocked before. Shall I let him in? But this time it is, I must abide at thy house. There was no knocking at the door, but smash went the door into atoms, and in he walked. I must, I shall, I will, I care not for your protesting, your vileness, your unbelief. I must, I will, I must abide in thy house. Ah, says one, I do not believe God would ever make me to believe as you believe, or become a Christian at all. Ah, but if he shall but say, today I must abide at thy house, there will be no resistance in you. There are some of you who would scorn the very idea of being a canting Methodist. What, sir, do you suppose I would ever turn one of your religious people? No, my friend, I don't suppose it. I know it for a certainty. If God says I must, there is no standing against it. Let him say must, and it must be. I will just tell you an anecdote proving this. A father was about sending his son to college, but as he knew the influence to which he would be exposed, he was not without a deep and anxious solicitude for the spiritual and eternal welfare of his favorite child, fearing lest the principles of Christian faith, which he had endeavored to instill into his mind, would be rudely assailed. But trusting in the efficacy of that word, which is quick and powerful, he purchased, unknown to his son, an elegant copy of the Bible, and deposited it at the bottom of his trunk. The young man entered upon his college career. The restraints of a pious education were soon broken off, and he proceeded from speculation to doubts, and from doubts to a denial of the reality of religion. After having become, in his own estimation, wiser than his father, he discovered one day, while rummaging his trunk, with great surprise and indignation, the sacred deposit. He took it out, and while deliberating on the manner in which he should treat it, he determined to use it as waste paper, in which to wipe his razor while shaving. Accordingly, every time he went to shave, he tore a leaf or two of the holy book, and thus used it till nearly half the volume was destroyed. But while he was committing this outrage upon the sacred book, a text now and then met his eye, and was carried like a barbed arrow to his heart. At length he heard a sermon, which discovered to him his own character, and his exposure to the wrath of God, and riveted upon his mind the impression which he has received from the last torn leaf of the blessed, yet insulted volume. Had worlds been at his disposal, he would freely have given them all, could they have availed in enabling him to undo what he had done. At length he found forgiveness at the foot of the cross. The torn leaves of that sacred volume brought healing to his soul, for they led him to repose on the mercy of God, which is sufficient for the chief of sinners. I tell you, there is not a reprobate walking the streets and defiling the air with his blasphemies. There is not a creature abandoned so as to be well nigh as bad as Satan himself, if he is a child of life who is not within the reach of mercy. And if God says, "Today I must abide in thy house," he then assuredly will. Do you feel, my dear hearer, just now, something in your mind which seems to say you have held out against the gospel a long while, but today you can hold out no longer? Do you feel that a strong hand has got hold of you, and do you hear a voice saying, "Sinner, I must abide in thy house"? You have often scorned me, you have often laughed at me, you have often spit in the face of mercy, often blasphemed me, but sinner, I must abide in thy house. You banged the door yesterday in the missionary's face, you burned the tract, you laughed at the minister, you have cursed God's house, you have violated the Sabbath. But sinner, I must abide in thy house, and I will. What, Lord, you say? Abide in my house? Why, it is covered all over with iniquity. Abide in my house? Why, there is not a chair or a table but would cry out against me. Abide in my house? Why, the joists and beams and flooring would all rise up and tell thee I am not worthy to kiss the hem of thy garment. What, Lord? Abide in my house? Yes, says he, I must. There is a strong necessity. My powerful love constrains me, and whether thou wilt let me or no, I am determined to make thee willing, and thou shalt let me in. Does not this surprise you, that Christ not only asks you to come to him, but invites himself to your table, and what is more, when you would pull him away, kindly says, I will come in. Only think of Christ going after a sinner, crying after a sinner, beginning a sinner to let him save him. And that is just what Jesus does to his chosen ones. The sinner runs away from him, but free grace pursues him and says, Sinner, come to Christ. And if our hearts be shut up, Christ puts his hand in at the door, and if we do not rise, but repulse him coldly, he says, I will come in. He weeps over us till his tears win us. He cries after us till his cries prevail. And at last, in his own well-determined hour, he enters into our heart, and there he dwells. I must abide in thy house, said Jesus. And now lastly, this call was an effectual one, for we see the fruits it brought forth. Open was Zacchaeus' door, spread was his table, generous was his heart, washed were his hands, unburdened with his conscience, joyful was his soul. Here, Lord, says he, the half of my goods I give to the poor. I dare say I have robbed them of half my property, and now I restore it. And if I have taken anything from any one by false accusation, I will restore to him fourfold. Away goes another portion of his property. Ah, Zacchaeus, you will go to be tonight a great deal poorer than when you got up this morning, but infinitely richer too. Poor, very poor, in this world's goods, compared with what thou wert when thou first didst climb that sycamore tree, but richer, infinitely richer, in heavenly treasure. Sinner, we shall know whether God calls you by this. If he calls, it will be an effectual call, not a call which you hear and then forget, but one which produces good works. If God hath called thee this morning, down will go that drunken cup, up will go thy prayers. If God hath called thee this morning, there will not be one shutter up today in your shop, but all, and you will have a notice stuck up. This house is closed on the Sabbath day, and will not again on that day be opened. Tomorrow there will be such and such worldly amusement. But if God hath called you, you will not go. And if you have robbed anybody, and who knows but I may have a thief here, if God call you, then there will be a restoration of what you have stolen. You will give up all that you have, so that you will follow God with all your heart. We do not believe a man to be converted, unless he doth renounce the error of his ways, unless, practically, he is brought to know that Christ himself is master of his conscience, and his law is his delight. Zacchaeus, make haste and come down, I must abide at thy house. And he made haste, and came down, and received him joyfully. And Zacchaeus stood, and said unto the Lord, Behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor. And if I have taken anything from any man by false accusation, I restore him fourfold. And Jesus said unto him, This day is salvation come to this house, for so much as he is also a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man is come to seek and to save that which was lost. Now, one or two lessons. A lesson to the proud. Come down, proud hearts, come down. Mercy runneth in valleys, but it goeth not to the mountain top. Come down, lofty spirit. The lofty city, he layeth it low even to the ground, and then he buildeth it up. Again, a lesson to thee, poor despairing soul. I am glad to see thee in God's house this morning. It's a good sign. I care not what you came for. You heard there was a strange kind of man that preached here, perhaps. Never mind about that. You are all quite as strange as he is. It is necessary that there should be strange men to gather in other strange men. Now, I have a mass of people here, and if I might use a figure, I should compare you to a great heap of ashes, mingled with which are a few steel filings. Now my sermon, if it be attended with divine grace, will be a sort of magnet. It will not attract any of the ashes. They will keep just where they are, but it will draw out the steel filings. I have got a Zacchaeus there. There is a Mary up there, a John down there, a Sarah or a William or a Thomas there, God's chosen ones. They are steel filings in the congregation of ashes. And my gospel, the gospel of the blessed God, like a great magnet, draws them out of the heap. There they come, there they come. Why? Because there was a magnetic power between the gospel and their hearts. Ah, poor sinner, come to Jesus, believe his love, trust his mercy. If thou hast a desire to come, and if thou art forcing thy way through the ashes to get to Christ, then it is because Christ is calling thee. Oh, all of you who know yourselves to be sinners, every man, woman, and child of you, yea, ye little children, for God has given me some of you to be my wages. Do you feel yourselves sinners? Then believe on Jesus and be saved. You have come here from curiosity, many of you. Oh, that you might be met with and saved. I am distressed for you, lest you should sink into hellfire. Oh, listen to Christ while he speaks to you. Christ says, come down this morning. Go home and humble yourselves in the sight of God. Go and confess your iniquities that you have sinned against him. Go home and tell him that you are a wretch, undone without his sovereign grace, and then look to him, for rest assured he has first looked to you. You say, Sir, oh, I am willing enough to be saved, but I am afraid he is not willing. Stay, no more of that. Do you know that that is part blasphemy? Not quite. If you were not ignorant, I would tell you that it was part blasphemy. You cannot look to Christ before he has looked to you. If you are willing to be saved, he gave you that will. Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and be baptized, and thou shalt be saved. I trust the Holy Spirit is calling you. Young man up there, young man in the window, make haste, come down. Old man sitting in these pews, come down. Merchant in yonder aisle, make haste. Matron and youth, not knowing Christ, oh may he look at you. Old grandmother, hear the gracious call, and thou young lad, Christ may be looking at thee. I trust he is, and saying to thee, make haste and come down, for today I must abide at thy house. End of Charles Spurgeon's sermon number 73, 1856. Effectual Calling.
The Follies of Legislatures by Eltwede Pomeroy, from The Green Bag, January 1900. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. There's a story told of how the two English egotists, Oscar Wilde and the painter Whistler, once met on the streets of London, and Wilde said to Whistler, "Ah, the dear public thinks, when we meet and talk, that we are talking of art, but instead we are talking of ourselves, aren't we?" Whistler, happening to be both an abler man and a wit, replied, "My dear Wilde, you greatly mistake. When we meet, we don't talk of ourselves, we talk of myself." So the dear public often thinks that when legislatures meet, they talk about the needs and wishes and sufferings of the great common people. But if it got behind the scenes, it would find that subject given scant attention, save as it affects each legislature's future, and that too often the talk is about ourselves, while the voting usually has reference to myself. So long as we give a committee of men uncontrolled power over us, for just so long will they use that power for their own ends. And if they are chosen frequently, as our legislators are, they will retain a certain portion of the noble spirit of service to the whole people. As long as they are new at the service, crude and inefficient, they will make lots of mistakes, be easily led by designing men who know the ropes, and by the end of the term either be ready to retire in disgust because they deem nothing can be accomplished, or to adopt the prevailing low moral tone, look at every bill from the point of "what is there in it for me?" and be fit subjects for the lobbyist. Thus, the last legislature of the sovereign state of Missouri passed a bill called the Pure Beer Law through both houses, and it was signed by the governor. This provides that, quote, "no person or persons or corporation engaged in the brewing or manufacture of beer or other malt liquor shall use any substance, material, or chemical in the manufacture of beer or other malt liquors, other than pure hops or extract of hops, or pure barley, malt, or wholesome yeast or rice." Unquote. Water is not mentioned, and, as nothing but the above substances may be used, the people of Missouri are wondering whether they will take their beer in solid form, or how. Perhaps someone will come out with beer tablets. Down in Texas, the lower house passed what was called a single tax law, which it was with a vengeance. It provided that every unmarried man over 30 who had not, quote, "exerted due diligence," end quote, in getting married should pay a fine of $50 every year. In order to define due diligence, the bachelor's fine was to be remitted if he brought in yearly an affidavit from some reputable woman that he had offered himself in marriage to her during that year. The 1897 Missouri legislature also had a single tax law, but it took the other tack and fined widows and maidens, quote, "not less than $100 nor over $500, unquote, for rejecting a man. It was finally amended to add to the fine the provision that the fair one should darn the socks and sew on buttons for the rejected suitor for 6 months. This laughed it out of the House. But the West is not the only offender. New Jersey passed a law taxing bachelors in 1846, and as I never heard of its repeal, it may still be accumulating dust among the archives, and is one of those things the executive swears to enforce, but does not know of and practically cannot know because there are so many of them. But the 1898 New Jersey legislature sent to be engrossed a law for taxing bachelors. It is about on a par with the one introduced in 1896 in the same state, prohibiting the picking of huckleberries with the feet. At Albany, one of the Tammany legislators, who did not know a bill from a highwayman's billy, was told he ought to have a law named after himself. So he introduced a measure and secured its passage through the Assembly, which made it a penal offense to put less than 13 oysters in an oyster stew. This would be hard on church fairs. Another august legislator, I presume he was from the rural districts this time, introduced a bill making it a felony to entice away bees, particularly when they are swarming. And this was only killed by a city member moving to amend that every bee should have its owner's name and address stamped on its business end for identification. But this is not worse than the ordinance introduced into the Common Council of New York City, which its mover explained as follows, quote, "One of the greatest perils of this big city," he said, "is the danger of being run down by streetcars. Every person hit by a streetcar is struck by the front platform. Am I right? Of course I am. You never hear of a man being knocked down by the rear platform or by the side of the car. Now the remedy is simple. My resolution abolishes front platforms." End of quote. Another kind of law, passed in Nebraska in early days, has an equally funny mistake in it. A part of it reads, quote, "For the violation of the third section of an act to license and regulate the sale of malt, spirituous and vinous liquors, $25, and on proof of the violation of said section or any part thereof, the justice shall render judgment for the whole amount of costs and be committed to the common jail until the sum is paid." End of quote. If this law was enforced, many a justice in Nebraska would languish in the common jail. Similar to this is Bill number 251 of the Kentucky legislature, which reads, quote, "It shall be unlawful for any person to fire or discharge at random any deadly weapon, whether said weapon be loaded or unloaded." End of quote. Really, that legislature must have had in view the damage done by weapons thought to be unloaded. Michigan has on its statute books the Weight Anti-Treating Law, passed in 1895, which prohibits the purchase of liquor to be given to another as a treat. And in South Carolina, private dispensaries became so obnoxious that a bill was introduced making it unlawful for a citizen of that state to wear hip pockets in his trousers, the minimum penalty being $150 and 6 months imprisonment. Ye gods and little fishes! What would the governor of South Carolina do when he was visited by his brother of North Carolina? Despite the fact that the Outlook is the authority for the statement, I think we may well believe that the governor of South Carolina vetoed it when it came into his august presence. But I would call his honor's attention to the action of the Ohio lawmakers in 1898 as worthy of imitation, even if he had to issue a special message recommending it. They defeated the Adams Bill, legalizing the weakening of whiskey with water. The Kansas lower house of 1898, while one of their members with an unpronounceable Russian name was absent, rushed through a bill changing his name to Pat Murphy. I cannot remember the name, but if I could write down such an unheard-of jumble of consonants and vowels, you would also judge that this was an unusual inspiration of common sense. An illustration of one of the tragedies of our lawmaking is the effort of the Pennsylvania miners, extending over years, to get a law prohibiting the payment of wages in store orders. They got such a law through a year or so ago, but in some committee or in engrossing, the words, quote, "on demand," unquote, were inserted, so that the law reads, quote, "all wages shall be paid in cash on demand," unquote. If a miner demands his wages in cash, he is laid off the next week. The insertion of those two little words has rendered the law utterly useless. It is a real tragedy. A courageous Indiana legislature proposes to fine a baggage man every time he throws a piece of baggage from the car down to the platform, instead of gently transferring it to a truck only a few inches lower than the bottom of the car. The lawmakers of Texas have made a bid for our foreign travel by bravely passing a resolution that the skies of Texas are bluer than those of Italy. It made no difference that perhaps none of them had visited Italy. Of course, everything about Texas is better than anything anywhere else, even unto the skies. A righteous Tennessee senator would, quote, "forbid any person to linger or loiter on any street, alley, road, or lane in the vicinity of any young lady's boarding school. Neither shall anyone try to communicate secretly with the inmates of such institution, nor loaf, lurk, and loiter where the inmates of such institution are likely to be found." End of quote. That last clause is delicious. Deponent saith not whether this loaf, lurk, and loiter bill was passed, but the wicked Virginia Senate of 1898 defeated Senator McCain's anti-flirting bill by 24-9. Rhode Island has recently gotten into a peck of trouble on social questions. One of the courts has just passed on an ambiguous law of some 50 years ago, according to which there has not been a legal marriage in that state in half a century. Every child born of parents married in Rhode Island is illegitimate and a bastard. Down in Louisville in the winter of 1898, there was a terrible hubbub which threatened to change the whole course of politics. Some good people got after the grand jury about the open saloons and gambling houses. One of their members fortunately recollected a law introduced by a country member and enacted some time previously, which prohibited the keeping of red birds, martins, or other wild songbirds in cages, and fined offenders. Of course, this had never been enforced, but there it was on the statute books. So they called the chief of police, Jacob Hager, and sternly demanded to know why he had not enforced the red bird law. Chief Hager was new, and he thought this meant business. By noon the next day, 400 citizens had been ordered to let their red birds go or pay the fine. The clamor became so great that it threatened to disrupt the political party who had control of the town. Its enforcement was suspended, and of course those who were willing to condone the lack of enforcement of one law could not vigorously demand the enforcement of the law against faro banks, crap games, pool rooms, and brothels. In Toledo, the church people thought they would catch Mayor Jones in a trap shortly after he was elected the first time. So they introduced in the council, in which he had a deciding vote on that question, a resolution demanding the enforcement of the law for Sunday closing of saloons. He said he should vote for it if it was amended to read the enforcement of the law for Sunday closing of all shops or stores mentioned in the law. The proposers could not object to that, though they did not want it, and it passed. For 2 Sundays, not only were the saloons closed as tight as a drum, but also not a streetcar ran, not a paper was sold, not a milk wagon dared to go on its route. The law was enforced impartially, and then the Common Council, moved by the wrath of the people, got together and repealed every Sunday ordinance they had ever passed, and Toledo has a quiet Sunday without them. In 1896, there was a wave of legislative sentiment against tall hats in theaters. Bills were introduced in almost every state legislature, and passed in New York, New Jersey, Illinois, Missouri, Nebraska, and Colorado. In the latter state, there is a fine of $25 and damages not to exceed $60. Of course, they are not enforced. Minnesota legislators presumably duly considered the phrenology bills submitted to them by one of the honorables. One provided for a state phrenologist with an assistant who should examine not less than 2,000 heads in a year. In Wisconsin, some barber legislator introduced an anti-whisker law so that there might be more shaving. In Illinois, every barber has to pass an examination and be licensed. Of course, it is a farce for getting fees into the pocket of some official. Missouri would prevent its people from eating green watermelons by appointing a watermelon inspector, and the bill was only defeated when a venerable member moved that the inspector's title should be, quote, "the official plugger, muncher, and taster of the state of Missouri," unquote. Also, the same legislature sent to engrossment a bill preventing card playing on the first day of the week. An honorable at Albany wanted to have an inspector of horseshoeing, and another to make chiropody a profession with a license, and a third would revoke the license of teachers who used tobacco. In Massachusetts, Representative Timo would prohibit hens and roosters from wearing trousers. And so it goes, almost ad libitum, certainly ad nauseam. I was brought up to reverence law, but on looking into it I find a great deal of it utterly unworthy of reverence, and much absolutely unenforceable. The reason is that we are afraid to elect the same man more than 2 terms. We give him an uncontrolled power over us, and then, feeling that he cannot stand more than a short term of such uncontrolled power, we do not keep him there. If we would take away from him this dangerous power of enacting laws, and choose legislators as counselors or advisers to the people, then we could keep a legislator in office indefinitely. He could not become corrupted because he could not deliver the goods. The people would vote on laws. This is done in Switzerland, where the people can vote on any law passed by the legislative body. It results in laws which are noted for their scarcity, simplicity, and enforceability. and in the further fact that legislators are re-elected for term after term. This is called direct legislation and consists of two things. By the referendum, no law goes into effect within a reasonable length of time unless approved by the people. If, during that time, say 60 days for state law, a minority of the voters, say 5%, sign a petition to have it referred to the whole people, it is held over till the next election, when the people vote on it, a majority accepting or rejecting it. By the initiative, a reasonable minority of the voters can propose a law which, if not passed by the legislature, goes to a vote of the people. The two together give the people constant and firm control over their own lawmaking. It would do away with the legislative follies and corruptions with which this article deals, as well as many other evils. End of The Follies of Legislatures by Eltweed Pomeroy. Recording by Colleen McMahon.
John S. Sargent by Henry James, from Harper's New Monthly Magazine, Volume 75, October 1887. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. I was on the point of beginning this sketch of the work of an artist to whom distinction has come very early in life by saying, in regard to the degree to which the subject of it enjoys the attention of the public, that no American painter has hitherto won himself such recognition from the expert. But I find myself pausing at the start, as on the edge of a possible solecism. Is Mr. Sargent, in very fact, an American painter? The proper answer to such a question is doubtless that we shall be well advised to claim him, and the reason of this is simply that we have an excellent opportunity. Born in Europe, he has spent his life in Europe, but nonetheless the burden of proof would rest with those who should undertake to show that he is a European. Moreover, he has even on the face of it this great symptom of an American origin, that in the line of his art he might easily be mistaken for a Frenchman. It sounds like a paradox, but it is a very simple truth that when today we look for American art, we find it mainly in Paris. When we find it out of Paris, we at least find a great deal of Paris in it. Mr. Sargent came up to the irresistible city in his 20th year, from Florence, where in 1856 he had been born of American parents, and where his fortunate youth had been spent. He entered immediately the studio of Carolus Duran, and revealed himself in 1877, at the age of 22, in the portrait of that master, a fine model in more than one sense of the word. He was already in possession of a style, and if this style has gained both in delicacy and in assurance, it has not otherwise varied. As he saw and rendered 10 years ago, so he sees and renders today, and I may add that there is no present symptom of his passing into another manner. Those who have appreciated his work most up to the present time emit no wish for a change, so completely does that work seem to them, in its kind, the exact translation of his thought, the exact fit of his artistic temperament. It is difficult to imagine a young painter being less in the dark about his own ideal, having from the first more the air of knowing what he desires. In an altogether exceptional degree does he give us the sense that an intention and the art of carrying it out are for him one and the same thing. In the brilliant portrait of Carolus Duran, which he was speedily and strikingly to surpass, he gave almost the full measure of this admirable peculiarity, that perception with him is already by itself a kind of execution. It is likewise so, of course, with many another genuine painter. But in Mr. Sargent's case, the process by which the object seen resolves itself into the object pictured is extraordinarily immediate. It is as if painting were pure tact of vision, a simple manner of feeling. From the time of his first successes at the Salon, he has hailed, I believe, as a recruit of high value to the camp of the Impressionists, and today he is, for many people, most conveniently pigeonholed under that head. It is not necessary to protest against the classification if this addition always be made to it, that Mr. Sargent's impressions happen to be interesting. This is by no means inveterately the case with those of the ingenious artists who most rejoice in the title in question. To render the impression of an object may be a very fruitful effort, but it is not necessarily so. That will depend upon what, I won't say the object, but the impression may have been. The talents engaged in this school lie, not unjustly, as it seems to me, under the suspicion of seeking the solution of their problem exclusively in simplification. If a painter works for other eyes as well as his own, he courts a certain danger in this direction, that of being arrested by the cry of the spectator, "Ah, but excuse me, I myself take more impressions than that." We feel a synthesis not to be an injustice only when it is rich. Mr. Sargent simplifies, I think, but he simplifies with style, and his impression in most cases is magnificent. His work has been almost exclusively in portraiture, and it has been his fortune to paint more women than men. Therefore he has had but a limited opportunity to reproduce that generalized grand air with which his view of certain figures of gentlemen invests the model, which is conspicuous in the portrait of Carolus Duran, and of which his splendid Docteur Posy, the distinguished Paris surgeon, a work not sent to the Salon, is an admirable example. In each of these cases the model has been of a gallant pictorial type, one of the types which strike us as made for portraiture, which is by no means the way of all, as especially appears, for instance, in the handsome hands and frilled wrists of Monsieur Carolus, whose cane rests in his fine fingers as if it were the hilt of a rapier. The most brilliant of all Mr. Sargent's productions is the portrait of a young lady, the magnificent picture which he exhibited in 1881, and if it has mainly been his fortune since to commemorate the fair faces of women, there is no ground for surprise at this sort of success on the part of one who had given so signal a proof of his having the secret of the particular aspect that the contemporary lady of any period likes to wear in the eyes of posterity. Painted when he was but 24 years of age, the picture by which Mr. Sargent was represented at the Salon of 1881 is a performance which may well have made any critic of imagination rather anxious about his future. In common with the superb group of the children of Mr. Edward Boit, exhibited 2 years later, it offers the slightly uncanny spectacle of a talent which, on the very threshold of its career, has nothing more to learn. It is not simply precocity in the guise of maturity, a phenomenon we very often meet, which deceives us only for an hour. It is the freshness of youth, combined with the artistic experience really felt and assimilated of generations. My admiration for this deeply distinguished work is such that I am perhaps in danger of overstating its merits, but it is worth taking into account that today, after several years of acquaintance with them, these merits seem to me more and more to justify enthusiasm. The picture has this sign of productions of the first order, that its style clearly would save it, if everything else should change, our measure of its value of resemblance, its expression of character, the fashion of dress, the particular associations it evokes. It is not only a portrait, but a picture, and it arouses even in the profane spectator something of the painter's sense, the joy of engaging also by sympathy in the solution of the artistic problem. There are works of which it is sometimes said that they are painters' pictures. This description is apt to be intended invidiously, and the production of which I speak has the good fortune at once to belong to this class, and to give the plain man the kind of pleasure that the plain man looks for. The young lady, dressed in black satin, stands upright, with her right hand bent back, resting on her waist, while the other, with the arms somewhat extended, offers to view a single white flower. The dress, stretched at the hips over a sort of hoop, and ornamented in front, where it opens on a velvet petticoat with large satin bows, has an old-fashioned air, as if it had been worn by some demure princess who might have sat for Velasquez. The hair, of which the arrangement is odd and charming, is disposed in 2 or 3 large curls fastened at one side over the temple with a comb. Behind the figure is the vague, faded sheen, exquisite in tone, of a silk curtain, light, undefined, and losing itself at the bottom. The face is young, candid, peculiar, and delightful. Out of these few elements the artist has constructed a picture which it is impossible to forget, of which the most striking characteristic is its simplicity, and yet which overflows with perfection. Painted with extraordinary breadth and freedom, so that surface and texture are interpreted by the lightest hand, it glows with life, character, and distinction, and strikes us as the most complete, with one exception perhaps, of the author's productions. I know not why this representation of a young girl in black, engaged in the casual gesture of holding up a flower, should make so ineffaceable an impression, and tempt one to become almost lyrical in its praise. But I well remember that, encountering the picture unexpectedly in New York a year or 2 after it had been exhibited in Paris, it seemed to me to have acquired an extraordinary general value, to stand for more artistic truth than it would be easy to declare, to be a masterpiece of color as well as of composition, to possess much in common with a Velasquez of the first order, and to have translated the appearance of things into the language of painting with equal facility and brilliancy. The language of painting, that is the tongue in which exclusively Mr. Sargent expresses himself, and into which a considerable part of the public, for the simple and excellent reason that they don't understand it, will doubtless always be reluctant and unable to follow him. The notation of painting, as one may call it, the signs by which objects are represented, is a very special affair, and of the special the public at large has always a perceptible mistrust. Fortunately, the spirit, the feeling of this magnificent art is not special, but as general and comprehensive as life itself. 2 years before he exhibited The Young Lady in Black, in 1879, Mr. Sargent had spent several months in Spain, and here, even more than he had already been, the great Velasquez became the god of his idolatry. No scenes are more delightful to the imagination than those in which we figure youth and genius confronted with great examples. And if such matters did not belong to the domain of private life, we might entertain ourselves with reconstructing the episode of the first visit to the Museum of Madrid, the shrine of the painter of Philip IV, of a young Franco-American worshipper of the highest artistic sensibility, expecting a supreme revelation and prepared to fall on his knees. It is evident that Mr. Sargent fell on his knees, and that in this attitude he passed a considerable part of his sojourn in Spain. He is various and experimental. If I am not mistaken, he sees each work that he produces in a light of its own, and does not turn off successive portraits according to some well-tried receipt which has proved useful in the case of their predecessors. Nevertheless, there is one idea that pervades them all in a different degree, and gives them a family resemblance, the idea that it would be inspiring to know just how the great Spaniard would have treated the theme. We can fancy that on each occasion Mr. Sargent, as a solemn preliminary, invokes him as a patron saint. This is not, in my intention, tantamount to saying that the large canvas representing the contortions of a dancer in the lamp-lit room of a posada, which he exhibited on his return from Spain, strikes me as having come into the world under the same star as those great compositions of Velázquez, which at Madrid alternate with his royal portraits. This singular work, which has found a somewhat incongruous home in Boston, has the stamp of an extraordinary energy and facility, of an actual scene with its accidents and peculiarities caught, as distinguished from a composition where arrangement and invention have played their part. It looks like life, but it looks also, to my view, rather like a perversion of life, and has the quality of an enormous note or memorandum rather than of a representation. A woman in a very voluminous white silk dress and black mantilla is pirouetting in the middle of a dusky room, to the accompaniment of her own castanets, and that of a row of men and women who sit in straw chairs against the whitewashed wall, and thrum upon guitar and tambourine, or lift other castanets into the air. She appears almost colossal, and the twisted and inflated folds of her long dress increase her volume. She simpers in profile, with a long chin, while she slants back at a dangerous angle, and the lamp light, it proceeds from below as if she were on a big platform, makes a strange play in her large face. In the background, the straight line of black-clad, black-hatted, white-shirted musicians projects shadows against the wall, on which placards, guitars, and dirty finger marks display themselves. The merit of this production is that the air of reality is given in it with remarkable breadth and boldness. Its defect it is difficult to express, save by saying that it makes the spectator vaguely uneasy and even unhappy, an accident the more to be regretted as a life-inspired female figure given up to the emotion of the dance is not intrinsically a displeasing object. El Jaleo sins, in my opinion, in the direction of ugliness, and independently of the fact that the heroine is circling round, incommoded by her petticoats, has a want of serenity. This is not the defect of the charming, dusky, white-robed person who, in the Tangerine subject, exhibited at the Salon of 1880, the fruit of an excursion to the African coast at the time of the artist's visit to Spain, stands on a rug under a great white Moorish arch, and from out of the shadows of the large drapery, raised pentwise by her hands, which covers her head, looks down with painted eyes and brows showing above a bandaged mouth at the fumes of a beautiful censer or chafing dish placed on the carpet. I know not who this stately Mohammedan may be, nor in what mysterious domestic or religious rite she may be engaged, but in her muffled contemplation and her pearl-colored robes under her plastered arcade, which shines in the eastern light, she is beautiful and memorable. The picture is exquisite, a radiant effect of white upon white, of similar but discriminated tones. In dividing the honor that Mr. Sargent has won by his finest work between the portrait of the young lady of 1881 and the group of 4 young girls which was painted in 1882 and exhibited, with the success it deserved, the following year, I must be careful to give the latter picture not too small a share. The artist has done nothing more felicitous and interesting than this view of a rich, dim, rather generalized French interior, the perspective of a hall with a shining floor where screens and tall Japanese vases shimmer and loom, which encloses the life and seems to form the happy play world of a family of charming children. The treatment is eminently unconventional, and there is none of the usual symmetrical balancing of the figures in the foreground. The place is regarded as a whole. It is a scene, a comprehensive impression, yet none the less do the little figures in their white pinafores — when was the pinafore ever painted with that power and made so poetic — detach themselves and live with a personal life. 2 of the sisters stand hand in hand at the back, in the delightful, the almost equal company of a pair of immensely tall emblazoned jars which overtop them, and seem also to partake of the life of the picture. The splendid porcelain and the aprons of the children shine together, and a mirror in the brown depth behind them catches the light. Another little girl presents herself with abundant tresses and slim legs, her hands behind her, quite to the left, and the youngest, nearest to the spectator, sits on the floor and plays with her doll. The naturalness of the composition, the loveliness of the complete effect, the light, free security of the execution, the sense it gives us as of assimilated secrets and instinct and knowledge playing together, all this makes the picture as astonishing a work on the part of a young man of 26 as the portrait of 1881 was astonishing on the part of a young man of 24. It is these remarkable encounters that justify us in writing almost prematurely of a career which is not yet half unfolded. Mr. Sargent is sometimes accused of a want of finish, but if finish means the last word of expressiveness of touch, the Hall with the 4 children, as we may call it, may stand as a permanent reference on this point. If the picture of the Spanish dancer illustrates, as it seems to me to do, the latent dangers of the Impressionist practice, so this performance shows what victories it may achieve, and in relation to the latter, I must repeat what I said about the young lady with the flower, that this is the sort of work which, when produced in youth, leads the attentive spectator to ask unanswerable questions. He finds himself murmuring, "Ay, but what is left?" and even wondering whether it is an advantage to an artist to obtain early in life such possession of his means that the struggle with them, the discipline of tâtonnement, ceases to exist for him. May not this breed an irresponsibility of cleverness, a wantonness, an irreverence, what is vulgarly termed a larkiness on the part of the youthful genius who has, as it were, all his fortune in his pocket? Such are the possibly superfluous broodings of those who are critical, even in their warmest admirations, and who sometimes suspect that it may be better for an artist to have a certain part of his property invested in unsolved difficulties. When this is not the case, the question with regard to his future simplifies itself somewhat portentously. What will he do with it, we ask, meaning by the pronoun the sharp, completely forged weapon. It becomes more purely a question of responsibility, and we hold him altogether to a higher account. This is the case with Mr. Sargent. He knows so much about the art of painting that he perhaps does not fear emergencies quite enough, and that, having knowledge to spare, he may be tempted to play with it and waste it. Various, curious, as we have called him, he occasionally tries experiments which seem to arise from the mere high spirits of his brush, and runs risks little courted by the votaries of the literal, who never expose their necks to escape from the common. For the literal and the common he has the smallest taste. When he renders an object into the language of painting, his translation is a generous paraphrase. As I have intimated, he has painted little but portraits, but he has painted very many of these, and I shall not attempt in so few pages to give a catalogue of his works. Every canvas that has come from his hands has not figured at the Salon. Some of them have seen the light at other exhibitions in Paris, some of them in London, of which city Mr. Sargent is now an inhabitant, at the Royal Academy and the Grosvenor Gallery. If he has been mainly represented by portraits, there are 2 or 3 little subject pictures of which I retain a grateful memory. There stands out in particular, as a pure gem, a small picture exhibited at the Grosvenor, representing a small group of Venetian girls of the lower class sitting in gossip together one summer's day in the big, dim hall of a shabby old palazzo. The shutters let in a clink of light. The scagliola pavement gleams faintly in it. The whole place is bathed in a kind of transparent shade. The tone of the picture is dark and cool. The girls are vaguely engaged in some very humble household work. They are counting turnips or stringing onions, and these small vegetables, enchantingly painted, look as valuable as magnified pearls. The figures are extraordinarily natural and vivid. Wonderfully light and fine is the touch by which the painter evokes all the small, familiar Venetian realities. He has handled them with a vigor altogether peculiar in various other studies, which I have not space to enumerate, and keeps the whole thing free from that element of humbug which has ever attended most attempts to reproduce the Italian picturesque. I am, however, drawing to the end of my remarks without having mentioned a dozen of those brilliant triumphs in the field of portraiture with which Mr. Sargent's name is preponderantly associated. I jumped from his Carolus Duran to the masterpiece of 1881 without speaking of the charming Madame Paleron of 1879, or the picture of this lady's children the following year. Many, or rather most, of Mr. Sargent's sitters have been French, and he has studied the physiognomy of this nation so attentively that a little of it, perhaps, remains in the brush with which today, more than in his first years, he represents other types. I have alluded to his superb Docteur Posy, to whose very handsome, still youthful head and slightly artificial posture he has given so fine a French cast that he might be excused if he should, even on remoter pretexts, find himself reverting to it. This gentleman stands up in his brilliant red dressing gown with the prestance of certain figures of Van Dyck. I should like to commemorate the portrait of a lady of a certain age and of an equally certain interest of appearance, a lady in black, with black hair, a black hat, and a vast feather, which was displayed at that entertaining little annual exhibition of the Mirletons in the Palace Vendôme, with the exquisite modeling of its face. No one better than Mr. Sargent understands the beauty that resides in exceeding fineness. This head remains in my mind as a masterly rendering of the look of experience, such experience as may be attributed to a woman slightly faded and eminently sensitive and distinguished. Subject and treatment in this valuable piece are of an equal interest, and in the latter there is an element of positive sympathy which is not always in a high degree the sign of Mr. Sargent's work. What shall I say of the remarkable canvas which, on the occasion of the Salon of 1884, brought the critics about our artist's ears, the already celebrated portrait of Madame G. It is an experiment of a highly original kind, and the painter has had in the case, in regard to what Mr. Ruskin would call the rightness of his attempt, the courage of his opinion. A beauty of beauties, according to Parisian fame, the lady stands upright beside a table on which her right arm rests, with her body almost fronting the spectator, and her face in complete profile. She wears an entirely sleeveless dress of black satin, against which her admirable left arm detaches itself. The line of her harmonious profile has a sharpness which Mr. Sargent does not always seek, and the crescent of Diana, an ornament in diamonds, rests on her exquisite head. This work had not the good fortune to please the public at large, and I believe it even excited a kind of unreasoned scandal, an idea sufficiently amusing in the light of some of the manifestations of the plastic effort to which each year the Salon stands sponsor. The picture will always remain interesting to those who follow the artist's career and note its different stages, even though they may not clearly see the light by which some portions of it are painted. It is a work to take or to leave, as the phrase is, and one in regard to which the question of liking or disliking comes promptly to be settled. It is full of audacity of experiment and science of execution. It has singular beauty of line, and certainly in the body and arms we feel the pulse of life as strongly as the brush can give it. Two of Mr. Sargent's recent productions have been portraits of American ladies, whom it must have been a delight to paint. I allude to those of Lady Playfair and Mrs. Henry White, both of which were seen in the Royal Academy of 1885, and the former subsequently in Boston, where it abides. These things possess largely the quality which makes Mr. Sargent so happy as a painter of women, a quality which can best be expressed by a reference to what it is not, to the curiously literal, prosaic, Philistine treatment to which, in the commonplace work that looks down at us from the walls of almost all exhibitions, delicate feminine elements have evidently so often been sacrificed. Mr. Sargent handles these elements with a special feeling for them, and they borrow something of nobleness from his brush. This nobleness is not absent from the two portraits I just mentioned, that of Lady Playfair and that of Mrs. Henry White. It looks out at us from the erect head and frank animation of the one, and the silvery sheen and shimmer of white satin and white lace, which form the setting of the slim tallness of the other. In the Royal Academy of 1886, Mr. Sargent was represented by 3 important canvases, all of which reminded the spectator of how much the brilliant effect he produces in an English exhibition arises from a certain appearance that he has of looking down from a height of cleverness, a kind of giddiness of facility at the artistic problems of the given case. Sometimes there is even a slight impertinence in it. That, doubtless, was the impression of many of the people who passed, staring with an ejaculation before the triumphant group of the 3 Misses V. These young ladies, seated in a row, with a room much foreshortened for a background, and treated with extraordinary freedom and vigor, excited in London a chorus of murmurs not dissimilar to that which it had been the fortune of the portrait exhibited in 1884 to elicit in Paris, and had the further privilege of drawing forth some prodigies of purblind criticism. Works of this character are a genuine service. After the short-lived gibes of the profane have subsided, they are found to have cleared the air. They remind people that the faculty of taking a fresh, direct, independent, unborrowed impression is not altogether lost. In this very rapid review, I have accompanied Mr. Sargent to a very recent date. If I have said that observers encumbered with a nervous temperament may at any moment have been anxious about his future, I have it on my own conscience to add that the day has not yet come for a complete extinction of this anxiety. Mr. Sargent is so young, in spite of the place allotted to him in these pages, so often a record of long careers and uncontested triumphs, that, in spite also of the admirable works he has already produced, his future is the most valuable thing he has to show. We may still ask ourselves what he will do with it, while we indulge the hope that he will see fit to give successors to the two pictures which I have spoken of emphatically as his best. There is no greater work of art than a great portrait, a truth to be constantly taken to heart by a painter holding in his hands the weapon that Mr. Sargent wields. The gift that he possesses completely, the immediate perception of the end and of the means. Putting aside the question of the subject, and to a great portrait a common sitter will doubtless not always conduce, the highest result is achieved when to this element of quick perception a certain faculty of lingering reflection is added. I use this name for want of a better, and I mean the quality in the light of which the artist sees deep into his subject, undergoes it, absorbs it, discovers in it new things that were not on the surface, becomes patient with it and almost reverent, and in short elevates and humanizes the technical problem. End of John S. Sargent by Henry James, from Harper's New Monthly Magazine, Volume 75, October 1887. Read for LibriVox by Sue Anderson.
A Meditation upon a Broomstick, from The Battle of the Books and Other Short Pieces by Jonathan Swift. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dale Grothmann. A Meditation upon a Broomstick by Jonathan Swift, according to the style and manner of the Honorable Robert Boyle's Meditations. This single stick, which you now behold ingloriously lying in that neglected corner, I once knew in a flourishing state in a forest. It was full of sap, full of leaves, full of boughs. But now in vain does the busy art of man pretend to vie with nature, by tying that withered bundle of twigs to its sapless trunk. It is now at best but the reverse of what it was, a tree turned upside down, the branches on the earth, and the roots in the air. It is now handled by every dirty wench condemned to do her drudgery, and, by a capricious kind of fate, destined to make other things clean and be nasty itself. At length, worn to the stumps in the service of the maids, it is either thrown out of doors or condemned to the last use of kindling a fire. When I behold this, I sighed, and said within myself, surely mortal man is a broomstick. Nature sent him into the world strong and lusty, in a thriving condition, wearing his own hair on his head, the proper branches of this reasoning vegetable, till the acts of intemperance has lopped off his green boughs and left him a withered trunk. He then flies to art and puts on a periwig, valuing himself upon an unnatural bundle of hairs, all covered with powder, that never grew on his head. But now should this our broomstick pretend to enter the scene, proud of those birchen spoils it never bore, and all covered with dust, through the sweepings of the finest lady's chamber, we should be apt to ridicule and despise its vanity, partial judges that we are of our own excellencies and other men's defaults. But a broomstick, perhaps you will say, is an emblem of a tree standing on its head. And pray, what is a man but a topsy-turvy creature, his animal facilities perpetually mounted on his rational, his head where his heels should be, groveling on the earth? And yet, with all his faults, he sets up to be a universal reformer and corrector of abuses, a remover of grievances, rakes into every slut's corner of nature, bringing hidden corruptions to light, and raises a mighty dust where there was none before, sharing deeply all the while in the very same pollutions he pretends to sweep away. His last days are spent in slavery to women, and generally the least deserving, till, worn to the stumps like his brother's besom, he is either kicked out of doors, or made use of to kindle flames for others to warm themselves by. The end of A Meditation upon a Broomstick by Jonathan Swift.
Niagara Falls by Rupert Brooke. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Peter Thomlinson. Samuel Butler has a lot to answer for. But for him, a modern traveller could spend his time peacefully admiring the scenery, instead of feeling himself bound to dog the simple and grotesque of the world for the sake of their too human comments. It is his fault if a peasant's naivety has come to outweigh the beauty of rivers, and the remarks of clergymen are more than mountains. It is very restful to give up all effort at observing human nature and drawing social and political deductions from trifles, and to let oneself relapse into wide-mouthed worship of the wonders of nature. And this is very easy at Niagara. Niagara means nothing. It is not leading anywhere. It does not result from anything. It throws no light on the effects of protection, nor on the facility for divorce in America, nor on corruption in public life, nor on Canadian character, nor even on the Navy Bill. It is merely a great deal of water falling over some cliffs. But it is very remarkable that the human race, apt as a child to destroy what it admires, has done its best to surround the falls with every distraction, incongruity, and vulgarity. Hotels, powerhouses, bridges, trams, picture postcards, sham legends, stalls, booths, rifle galleries and sideshows frame them about. And there are touts. Niagara is the central home and breeding place for all the touts of earth. There are touts insinuating, and touts raucous, greasy touts, brazen touts, and upper-class, refined, gentlemanly, take you by the arm touts, touts who intimidate and touts who wheedle. Professionals, amateurs, and dilettanti, male and female, touts who would photograph you with an arm round a young lady against a faked background of the sublimest cataract, touts who would bully you into cars, charabancs, elevators or tunnels, or deceive you into a carriage and pair, touts who would sell you picture postcards, moccasins, sham Indian beadwork, blankets, teepees and crockery, and touts, finally, who have no apparent object in the world but just purely, simply, merely, incessantly, indefatigably, and ineffably to tout. And in the midst of all this, overwhelming it all, are the falls. He who sees them instantly forgets humanity. They are not very high, but they are overpowering. They are divided by an island into two parts, the Canadian and the American. Half a mile or so above the falls, on either side, the waters of the great stream begins to run more swiftly and in confusion. It descends with ever-growing speed. It begins chattering and leaping, breaking into 1,000 ripples, throwing up joyful fingers of spray. Sometimes it is divided by islands and rocks. Sometimes the eye can see nothing but a waste of laughing, springing, foamy waves, turning, crossing, even seeming to stand for an instant erect, but always borne impetuously forward like a crowd of triumphant feasters. Sit close down by it, and you see a fragment of the torrent against the sky, mottled, steely and foaming, leaping onward in far-flung criss-cross strands of water. Perpetually the eye is on the point of descrying a pattern in this weaving, and perpetually it is cheated by change. In one place, part of the flood plunges over a ledge a few feet high and 1/4 of a mile or so long, in a uniform and stable curve. It gives an impression of almost military concerted movement, grown suddenly out of confusion. But it is swiftly lost again in the multitudinous, tossing merriment. Here and there a rock close to the surface is marked by a white wave that faces backwards and seems to be rushing madly upstream, but is really stationary in the headlong charge. But for these signs of reluctance, the waters seem to fling themselves on with some foreknowledge of their fate, in an ever wilder frenzy. But it is no Maeterlinckian prescience. They prove, rather, that Greek belief that the great crashes are preceded by a louder merriment and a wilder gaiety. Leaping in the sunlight, careless, entwining, clamorously joyful, the waves riot on towards the verge. But there they change. As they turn to the sheer descent, the white and blue and slate colour, in the heart of the Canadian Falls at least, blend and deepen to a rich, wonderful, luminous green. On the edge of disaster the river seems to gather herself, to pause, to lift a head noble in ruin, and then, with a slow grandeur, to plunge into the eternal thunder and white chaos below. Where the stream runs shallower, it is a kind of violet colour, but both violet and green fray and frill to white as they fall. The mass of water, striking some ever-hidden base of rock, leaps up the whole 200 feet again, in pinnacles and domes of spray. The spray falls back into the lower river once more, all but a little that finds to foam and white mist, which drifts in layers along the air, graining it, and wanders out on the wind over the trees and gardens and houses, and so vanishes. The manager of one of the great power stations on the banks of the river above the falls told me that the centre of the riverbed at the Canadian Falls is deep and of a saucer shape, so it may be possible to fill this up to a uniform depth and divert a lot of water for the powerhouses. And this, he said, would supply the need for more power, which will certainly soon arise, without taking away from the beauty of Niagara. This is a handsome concession of the utilitarians to ordinary sightseers. Yet I doubt if we shall be satisfied. The real secret of the beauty and terror of the falls is not their height or width, but the feeling of colossal power and of unintelligible disaster caused by the plunge of that vast body of water. If that were taken away, there would be little visible change, but the heart would be gone. The American Falls do not inspire this feeling in the same way as the Canadian. It is because they are less in volume, and because the water does not fall so much into one place. By comparison, their beauty is almost delicate and fragile. They are extraordinarily level, one long curtain of lacework and woven foam. Seen from opposite, when the sun is on them, they are blindingly white, and the clouds of spray show dark against them. With both falls, the colour of the water is the ever-altering wonder. Greens and blues, purples and whites melt into one another, fade and come again, and change with the changing sun. Sometimes they are as richly diaphanous as a precious stone, and glow from within with a deep, inexplicable light. Sometimes the white intricacies of dropping foam become opaque and creamy, and always there are the rainbows. If you come suddenly upon the falls from above, a great double rainbow, very vivid, spanning the extent of spray from top to bottom, is the first thing you see. If you wander along the cliff opposite, a bow springs into being in the American Falls, accompanies you courteously on your walk, dwindles and dies as the mist ends, and awakens again as you reach the Canadian tumult. And the bold traveller who attempts the trip under the American Falls sees, when he dare open his eyes to anything, tiny baby rainbows, some 4 or 5 yards in span, leaping from rock to rock among the foam and gambolling beside him, barely out of hand's reach as he goes. One I saw in that place was a complete circle, such as I have never seen before, and so near that I could put my foot on it. It is a terrifying journey beneath and behind the falls. The senses are battered and bewildered by the thunder of the water and the assault of wind and spray, or rather the sound is not of falling water, but merely of falling, a noise of unspecified ruin. So if you are close behind the endless clamour, the sight cannot recognize liquid in the masses that hurl past. You are dimly and pitifully aware that sheets of light and darkness are falling in great curves in front of you. Dull, omnipresent foam washes the face. Farther away, in the roar and hissing, clouds of spray seem literally to slide down some invisible plane of air. Beyond the foot of the falls, the river is like a slipping floor of marble, green with veins of dirty white, made by the scum that was foam. It slides very quietly and slowly down for a mile or two, suddenly exhausted. Then it turns to a dull sage green and hurries more swiftly, smooth and ominous. As the walls of the ravine close in, trouble stirs, and the waters boil and eddy. These are the lower rapids, a sight more terrifying than the falls, because less intelligible. Close in its bands of rock the river surges tumultuously forward, writhing and leaping as if inspired by a demon. It is pressed by the straits into a visibly convex form. Great plains of water slide past. Sometimes it is thrown up into a pinnacle of foam higher than a house, or leaps with incredible speed from the crest of one vast wave to another, along the shining curve between, like the spring of a wild beast. Its motion continually suggests muscular action. The power manifest in these rapids moves one with a different sense of awe and terror from that of the falls. Here the inhuman life and strength are spontaneous, active, almost resolute, masculine vigour compared with the passive, gigantic power, female, helpless and overwhelming, of the falls. A place of fear. One is drawn back, strangely, to a contemplation of the falls at every hour, and especially by night, when the cloud of spray becomes an immense visible ghost, straining and wavering high above the river, white and pathetic and translucent. The Victorian lies very close below the surface in every man. There one can sit and let great cloudy thoughts of destiny and the passage of empires drift through the mind, for such dreams are at home by Niagara. I could not get out of my mind the thought of a friend who said that the rainbows over the falls were like the arts and beauty and goodness with regard to the stream of life, caused by it, thrown upon its spray, but unable to stay or direct or affect it, and ceasing when it ceased. In all comparisons that rise in the heart, the river, with its multitudinous waves and its single current, likens itself to a life, whether of an individual or of a community. A man's life is of many flashing moments, and yet one stream. A nation's flows through all its citizens, and yet it is more than they. In such places one is aware, with an almost insupportable and yet comforting certitude, that both men and nations are hurried onwards to their ruin or ending as inevitably as this dark flood. Some go down to it unreluctant and meet it, like the river, not without nobility, and as incessant, as inevitable, and as unavailing as the spray that hangs over the falls is the white cloud of human crying. With some such thoughts does the platitudinous heart win from the confusion and thunder of a Niagara peace that the quietest plains or most stable hills can never give. End of Niagara Falls by Rupert Brooke. Recording by Peter Thomlinson.
Nikola Tesla the Man by Hugo Gernsback. This article was published in Electrical Experimenter, February 1919. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kane Mercer. Nikola Tesla the Man by Hugo Gernsback. The door opens and out steps a tall figure, over 6 feet high, gaunt but erect. It approaches slowly, stately. You become conscious at once that you are face to face with a personality of a high order. Nikola Tesla advances and shakes your hand with a powerful grip, surprising for a man over 60. A winning smile from piercing light blue-gray eyes, set in extraordinarily deep sockets, fascinates you and makes you feel at once at home. You are guided into an office immaculate in its orderliness. Not a speck of dust is to be seen. No papers litter the desk. Everything is just so. It reflects the man himself, immaculate in attire, orderly and precise in his every movement. Dressed in a dark frock coat, he is entirely devoid of all jewelry. No ring, stick pin, or even watch chain can be seen. Tesla speaks, a very high and almost falsetto voice. He speaks quickly and very convincingly. It is the man's voice chiefly which fascinates you. As he speaks, you find it difficult to take your eyes off his own. Only when he speaks to others do you have the chance to study his head, predominant of which is a very high forehead with a bulge between the eyes, the never-failing sign of an exceptional intelligence. Then, the long, well-shaped nose proclaiming the scientist. How does this man, who has accomplished such a tremendous work, keep young and manage to surprise the world with more and more inventions as he grows older? How does this youth of 60, who is a professor of mathematics, a great mechanical and electrical engineer, and the greatest inventor of all times, keep his physical as well as remarkable mental freshness? To begin with, Tesla, who is by birth a Serbian, comes from a long-lived hardy race. His family tree abounds with centenarians. Accordingly, Tesla, barring accidents, fully expects to be still inventing in AD 1960. But the chief reason for his perpetual youth is found in his gastronomical frugality. Tesla has learned the great fundamental truth that most people not only eat all of their bodily ills, but actually eat themselves to death by either eating too much or else by food that does not agree with them. When Tesla found out that tobacco and black coffee interfered with his physical well-being, he quit both. This is the simple daily menu of the great inventor. Breakfast: 1 or 2 pints of warm milk and a few eggs, prepared by himself. Yes, he is a bachelor. Lunch: none whatsoever, as a rule. Dinner: celery or the like, soup, a single piece of meat or fowl, potatoes and 1 other vegetable, a glass of light wine. For dessert, perhaps a slice of cheese, and invariably a big raw apple, and that's all. Tesla is very fussy and particular about his food. He eats very little, but what he does eat must be of the very best. And he knows, for outside of being a great inventor in science, he is an accomplished cook who has invented all sorts of savory dishes. His only voice is his generosity. The man who, by the ignorant onlooker, has often been called an idle dreamer, has made over $1 million out of his inventions and spend them as quickly on new ones. But Tesla is an idealist of the highest order, and to such men, money itself means but little. End of Nikola Tesla the Man by Hugo Gernsback.
The Actual Height of Sea Waves, from The Scrapbook, Volume 1, Number 2, April 1906. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Availle in December 2018. The Actual Height of Sea Waves. Average in different oceans. 52 feet the height of the tallest billow yet measured, not more than 30 feet in North Atlantic. Waves are the agents of tremendous force, as the batterings received by the big ocean liners in the winter storms tend to prove. But in spite of the stories told by timid or imaginative passengers on the Europe-America ferry, the surges of the North Atlantic are not the highest waves, nor the most forcible. The most tremendous of seas are those that form south of the Cape of Good Hope and Cape Horn, where the oceanic belt is unbroken by land. How high those southern waves rise has not been accurately measured, so far as can be discovered, but probably they are not very much higher than the waves farther north. Says the New York Sun, sailors in modern times have never seen such waves as those which the early navigators declared attained heights of 100 to 130 feet. La Pérouse asserted that he saw waves towering in the Pacific to a height of nearly 200 feet. In these more scientific days we may say that the highest wave yet measured had an altitude of about 52 feet. This was in the Southern Ocean, a little north of the Antarctic regions, and it is quite certain that the highest waves ever seen in that region did not surpass 58 feet in altitude. A wave of that height would certainly be a formidable-looking object, and its crest would wash the windows of the fifth story of many New York buildings. The average height of the waves in different oceans has been ascertained with some approach to accuracy as the result of a great many measurements. The highest waves observed in the Indian Ocean, for example, are about 40 feet. The highest waves in the North Atlantic are from 25 to 29 feet, and in the Mediterranean from 16 to 19 feet. Even the smallest of these great waves has considerable destructive power. Some of them travel along at a speed of 25 miles an hour. A wave about 30 feet high contains thousands of tons of water, and when this immense force is dashed against any structure, the ruin wrought is likely to be impressive. End of The Actual Height of Sea Waves.
On the Admission of Women to the Rights of Citizenship by Nicolas de Condorcet, 1743 to 1794. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. On the Admission of Women to the Rights of Citizenship by Nicolas de Condorcet. Custom may familiarize mankind with the violation of their natural rights to such an extent that even among those who have lost or been deprived of these rights, no one thinks of reclaiming them, or is even conscious that they have suffered any injustice. Certain of these violations of natural right have escaped the notice of philosophers and legislators, even while concerning themselves zealously to establish the common rights of individuals of the human race, and in this way to lay the foundation of political institutions, For example, have they not all violated the principle of the equality of rights in tranquilly depriving one half of the human race of the right of taking part in the formation of laws by the exclusion of women from the rights of citizenship? Could there be a stronger proof of the power of habit, even among enlightened men, than to hear invoked the principle of equal rights in favor of perhaps some 300 or 400 men who had been deprived of it by an absurd prejudice, and forget it when it concerns some 12,000,000 women? To show that this exclusion is not an act of tyranny, it must be proved either that the natural rights of women are not absolutely the same as those of men, or that women are not capable of exercising these rights. But the rights of men result simply from the fact that they are rational, sentient beings, susceptible of acquiring ideas of morality and of reasoning concerning those ideas. Women, having then the same qualities, have necessarily the same rights. Either no individual of the human species has any true rights, or all have the same. And he or she who votes against the rights of another, whatever may be his or her religion, color, or sex, has by that fact abjured his own. It would be difficult to prove that women are incapable of exercising rights of citizenship, although liable to become mothers of families, and exposed to other passing indispositions. Why may they not exercise rights of which it has never been proposed to deprive those persons who periodically suffer from gout, bronchitis, etc.? Admitting for the moment that there exists in men a superiority of mind, which is not the necessary result of a difference of education, which is by no means proved, but which should be, to permit of women being deprived of the natural right without injustice. This inferiority can only consist in 2 points. It is said that no woman has made any important discovery in science, or has given any proofs of the possession of genius in arts, literature, etc. But, on the other hand, it is not pretended that the rights of citizenship should be accorded only to men of genius. It is added that no woman has the same extent of knowledge, the same power of reasoning, as certain men. But what results from that? Only this, that with the exception of a limited number of exceptionally enlightened men, equality is absolute between women and the remainder of the men; that this small class apart, inferiority and superiority, are equally divided between the 2 sexes. But since it would be completely absurd to restrict to this superior class the rights of citizenship and the power of being entrusted with public functions, why should women be excluded any more than those men who are inferior to a great number of women? Lastly, shall it be said that there exists in the minds and hearts of women certain qualities which ought to exclude them from the enjoyment of their natural rights? Let us interrogate the facts. Elizabeth of England, Maria Theresa, the 2 Catherines of Russia, have they not shown that neither in courage nor in strength of mind are women wanting? Elizabeth possessed all the failings of women. Did these failings work more harm during her reign than resulted from the failings of men during the reign of her father, Henry VIII, or her successor, James I? Have the lovers of certain empresses exercised a more dangerous influence than the mistresses of Louis XIV, or Louis XV, or even of Henry IV? Will it be maintained that Mistress Macaulay would not have expressed her opinions in the House of Commons better than any representatives of the British nation? In dealing with the question of liberty of conscience, would she not have expressed more elevated principles than those of Pitt, as well as more powerful reasoning? Although as great an enthusiast on behalf of liberty as Mr. Burke could be on behalf of its opposite, would she, while defending the French Constitution, have made use of such absurd and offensive nonsense as that which this celebrated rhetorician made use of in attacking it? Would not the adopted daughter of Montaigne have better defended the rights of citizens in France in 1614 than the Councillor of Courtine, who was a believer in magic and occult powers? Was not the Princess des Ursins superior to Camillard? Could not the Marquis de Chalais have written equally as well as M. Roulet? Would Madame de Lampert have made laws as absurd and as barbarous as those of the Garde des Sceaux of Armenouville against Protestants, invaders of domestic privacy, robbers, and negroes? In looking back over the list of those who have governed the world, men have scarcely the right to be so very uplifted. Women are superior to men in the gentle and domestic virtues. They, as well as men, know how to love liberty, although they do not participate in all its advantages, and in republics they have been known to sacrifice themselves for it. They have shown that they possess the virtue of citizens whenever chance or civil disasters have brought them upon a scene from which they have been shut out by the pride and the tyranny of men in all nations. It has been said that women, in spite of much ability, of much sagacity, and of a power of reasoning carried to a degree equalling that of subtle dialecticians, yet are never governed by what is called reason. This observation is not correct. Women are not governed, it is true, by the reason and experience of men. They are governed by their own reason and experience. Their interests not being the same as those of men, by the default of the law, the same things not having the same importance for them as for men, they may, without failing in rational conduct, govern themselves by different principles, and tend towards a different result. It is as reasonable for a woman to concern herself respecting her personal attractions as it was for Demosthenes to cultivate his voice and his gestures. It is said that women, although superior in some respects to man, more gentle, more sensitive, less subject to those vices which proceed from egotism and hardness of heart, yet do not really possess the sentiment of justice, that they obey rather their feelings than their conscience. This observation is more correct, but it proves nothing. It is not nature, it is education, it is social existence which produces this difference. Neither the one nor the other has habituated women to the idea of what is just, but only to the idea of what is honnête, or respectable. Excluded from public affairs, from all those things which are judged of according to rigorous ideas of justice, or according to positive laws, the things with which they are occupied, and which are affected by them, are precisely those which are regulated by natural feelings of honesty, or rather propriety, and of sentiment. It is, then, unjust to allege, as an excuse for continuing to refuse to women the enjoyment of all their natural rights, motives which have only a kind of reality because women lack the experience which comes from the exercise of these rights. If reasons such as these are to be admitted against women, it will become necessary to deprive of the rights of citizenship that portion of the people who, devoted to constant labor, can neither acquire knowledge nor exercise their reason, and thus, little by little, only those persons would be permitted to be citizens who had completed a course of legal study. If such principles are admitted, we must, as a natural consequence, renounce the idea of a liberal constitution. The various aristocracies have only had such principles as these for foundation or excuse. The etymology of the word is a sufficient proof of this. Neither can the subjection of wives to their husbands be alleged against their claims, since it would be possible in the same statute to destroy this tyranny of the civil law. The existence of one injustice can never be accepted as a reason for committing another. There remain then only two objections to discuss, and in truth these can only oppose motives of expediency against the admission of women to the right of voting, which motives can never be held as a bar to the exercise of true justice. The contrary maxim has only too often served as the pretext and excuse of tyrants. It is in the name of expediency that commerce and industry groan in chains, and that Africa remains afflicted with slavery. It was in the name of public expediency that the Bastille was crowded, that the censorship of the press was instituted, that accused persons were not allowed to communicate with their advisers, that torture was resorted to. Nevertheless, we will discuss these objections so as to leave nothing without reply. It is necessary, we are warned, to be on guard against the influence exercised by women over men. We reply at once that this, like any other influence, is much more to be feared when not exercised openly, and that whatever influence may be peculiar to women, if exercised upon more than one individual at a time, will in so far become proportionately lessened. That since, up to this time, women have not been admitted in any country to absolute equality, since their empire has none the less existed everywhere, and since the more women have been degraded by the laws, the more dangerous has their influence been, it does not appear that this remedy of subjection ought to inspire us with much confidence. Is it not probable, on the contrary, that their special empire should diminish if women had less interest in its preservation, if it ceased to be for them their sole means of defense and of escape from persecution? If politeness does not permit to men to maintain their opinions against women in society, this politeness, it may be said, is near akin to pride. We yield a victory of no importance. Defeat does not humiliate when it is regarded as voluntary. Is it seriously believed that it would be the same in a public discussion on an important topic? Does politeness forbid the beginning of an action at law against a woman? But it will be said, this change will be contrary to general expediency, because it will take women away from those duties which nature has reserved for them. This objection scarcely appears to me well founded. Whatever form of constitution may be established, it is certain that in the present state of civilization among European nations, there will never be more than a limited number of citizens required to occupy themselves with public affairs. Women will no more be torn from their homes than agricultural laborers from their ploughs, or artisans from their workshops. And among the richer classes, we nowhere see women giving themselves up so persistently to domestic affairs that we should fear to distract their attention. And a really serious occupation or interest would take them less away than the frivolous pleasures to which idleness, a want of object in life, and an inferior education have condemned them. The principal source of this fear is the idea that every person admitted to exercise the rights of citizenship immediately aspires to govern others. This may be true to a certain extent, at a time when the Constitution is being established, but the feeling can scarcely prove durable. And so it is scarcely necessary to believe that because women may become members of national assemblies, they would immediately abandon their children, their homes, and their needles. They would only be the better fitted to educate their children and to rear men. It is natural that a woman should suckle her infant, that she should watch over its early childhood. Detained in her home by these cares, and less muscular than the man, it is also natural that she should lead a more retired, a more domestic life. A woman, therefore, as well as the man in a corresponding class of life, would be under the necessity of performing certain duties at certain times, according to circumstances. This may be a motive for not giving her the preference in an election, but it cannot be a reason for legal exclusion. Gallantry would doubtless lose by the change, but domestic customs would be improved by equality in this as in other things. Up to this time, the manner of all nations has been more or less brutal and corrupt. I only know of one exception, and that is in favor of the Americans of the United States, who are spread, few in number, over a wide territory. Up to this time, among all nations, legal inequality has existed between men and women, and it would not be difficult to show that, in these two phenomena, the second is one of the causes of the first, because inequality necessarily introduces corruption, and is the most common cause of it, even if it be not the sole cause. I now demand that opponents should condescend to refute these propositions by other methods than by pleasantries and declamations. Above all, that they should show me any natural difference between men and women, which may legitimately serve as foundation for the deprivation of a right. The equality of rights established between men by our new Constitution has brought down upon us eloquent declamations and never-ending pleasantries. But up till now no one has been able to oppose to it one single reason, and this is certainly neither from lack of talent nor lack of zeal. I venture to believe that it will be the same with regard to equality of rights between the two sexes. It is sufficiently curious that in a great number of countries women have been judged incapable of all public functions, yet worthy of royalty; that in France a woman has been able to be regent, and yet up to 1776 she could not be a milliner or dressmaker (marchand des modes) in Paris, except under cover of her husband's name. And that lastly, in our elective assemblies, they have accorded to rights of property what they have refused to natural right. Many of our noble deputies owe to ladies the honor of sitting among the representatives of the nation. Why, instead of depriving of this right women who were owners of landed estates, was it not extended to all those who possessed property, or were heads of households? Why, if it be found absurd to exercise the right of citizenship by proxy, deprive women of this right, rather than leave them the liberty of exercising it in person? End of On the Admission of Women to the Rights of Citizenship, by Nicolas de Condorcet, 1743 to 1794.
The Portal of the Unknown, by Andrew Jackson Davis, the Seer. From The Best Psychic Stories, edited by Joseph Louis French. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dale Grothmann. The Portal of the Unknown, by Andrew Jackson Davis, the Seer. When the hour of her death arrived, I was fortunately in a proper state of mind and body to produce the superior, clairvoyant condition. But previous to throwing my spirit into that condition, I sought the most convenient and favorable position that I might be allowed to make the observations entirely unnoticed and undisturbed. Thus situated and conditioned, I proceeded to observe and investigate the mysterious process of dying, and to learn what it is for an individual human spirit to undergo the changes consequent upon physical death or external dissolution. They were these. I saw that the physical organization could no longer subserve the diversified purposes or requirements of the spiritual principle, but the various internal organs of the body appeared to resist the withdrawal of the animating soul. The body and the soul, like two friends, strongly resisted the various circumstances which rendered their eternal separation imperative and absolute. These internal conflicts gave rise to manifestations of what seemed to be, to the material senses, the most thrilling and painful sensations. But I was unspeakably thankful and delighted when I perceived and realized the facts that these physical manifestations were indications, not of pain or unhappiness, but simply that the spirit was eternally dissolving its co-partnership with the material organism. Now the head of the body became suddenly enveloped in a fine, soft, mellow, luminous atmosphere, and as instantly I saw the cerebrum and the cerebellum expand their most interior positions. I saw them disconnect their appropriate galvanic functions, and then I saw them become highly charged with the vital electricity and the vital magnetism which permeate subordinate systems and structures. That is to say, the brain, as a whole, suddenly declared itself to be tenfold more positive over the lesser portions of the body than it ever was during the period of health. This phenomenon invariably precedes the physical dissolution. Now the process of dying, or the spirit's departure from the body, was fully commenced. The brain began to attract the elements of electricity, of magnetism, of motion, of life, and of sensation, into its various and numerous departments. The head became immensely brilliant, and I particularly remarked that just in the same proportions as the extremities of the organism grow dark and cold, the brain appears light and glowing. Now I saw, in the mellow spiritual atmosphere which emanated from and encircled her head, the indistinct outlines of the formation of another head. This new head unfolded more and more distinctly, and so indescribably compact and intensely brilliant did it become, that I could neither see through it nor gaze upon it as steadily as I desired. While this spiritual head was being eliminated and organized from out and above the material head, I saw that the surrounding aromal atmosphere, which had emanated from the material head, was in great commotion. But as the new head became more distinct and perfect, this brilliant atmosphere gradually disappeared. This taught me that those aromal elements, which were in the beginning of the metamorphosis attracted from the system into the brain, and thence eliminated in the form of an atmosphere, were indissolubly united in accordance with the divine principle of affinity in the universe, which pervades and destinates every particle of matter, and developed the spiritual head which I beheld. In the identical manner in which the spiritual head was eliminated and unchangeably organized, I saw, unfolding in their natural progressive order, the harmonious development of the neck, the shoulders, the breasts, and the entire spiritual organization. It appeared from this, even to an unequivocal demonstration, that the innumerable particles of what might be termed unparticled matter, which constitute the man's spiritual principle, were constitutionally endowed with certain elective affinities, analogous to the immortal friendship. The innate tendencies which the elements and essences of her soul manifest by uniting and organizing themselves were the efficient and immutable causes that unfolded and perfected her spiritual organization. The defects and deformities of her physical body were, in the spiritual body which I saw thus developed, almost completely removed. In other words, it seemed that these hereditary obstructions and influences were now removed, which originally arrested the full and proper development of her physical constitution, and therefore that her spiritual constitution being elevated above those obstructions, was enabled to unfold and perfect itself in accordance with the universal tendencies of all created things. While this spiritual formation was going on, which was perfectly visible to my spiritual perception, the material body manifested, to the outer vision of observing individuals in the room, many symptoms of unease and pain, but the indications were totally deceptive. They were wholly caused by the departure of the vital or spiritual forces from the extremities and viscera into the brain, and thence into the ascending organism. The spirit arose at right angles over the head or brain of the deserted body, but immediately previous to the final dissolution of the relationship which had for so many years subsisted between the two, the spiritual and material bodies, I saw, playing energetically between the feet of the elevated spiritual body and the head of the prostrate physical body, a bright stream or current of vital electricity. And here I perceive what I had never before obtained a knowledge of, that a small portion of this vital electrical element returned to the deserted body immediately subsequent to the separation of the umbilical thread, and that that portion of this element which passed back into the earthly organism instantly diffused itself through the entire structure, and thus prevented immediate decomposition. As soon as the spirit, whose departing hour I had thus watched, was wholly disengaged from the tenacious physical body, I directed my attention to the movements and emotions of the former, and I saw her begin to breathe the most interior and spiritual portions of the surrounding terrestrial atmosphere. At first it seemed with difficulty that she could breathe the new medium, but in a few seconds she inhaled and exhaled the spiritual elements of nature with the greatest possible ease and delight, and now I saw that she was in possession of exterior and physical proportions which were identical in every possible particular, improved and beautified, with those proportions which characterized her earthly organization. Indeed, so much like her former self was she that, had her friends beheld her as I did, they certainly would have exclaimed, as we often do upon the sudden return of a long-absent friend who leaves us and returns in health, "Why, how well you look! How improved you are!" Such was the nature, most beautifying in their extent, of the improvements that were wrought upon her. I saw her continue to conform and accustom herself to the new elements and elevating sensations which belong to the inner life. I did not particularly notice the workings and emotions of her newly awakened and fast unfolding spirit, except I was careful to remark her philosophical tranquillity throughout the entire process, and her non-participation with the different members of her family in their unrestrained bewailing of her departure from the earth, to unfold in love and wisdom throughout the eternal spheres. She understood at a glance that they could only gaze upon the cold and lifeless form which she had just deserted, and she readily comprehended the fact that it was owing to a want of true knowledge upon their parts that they thus vehemently regretted her merely physical death. The period required to accomplish the entire change which I saw was not far from 2 hours and a half, but this furnished no rule as to the time required for every spirit to elevate and reorganize itself above the head of the outer form. Without changing my position or spiritual perceptions, I continued to observe the movements of her newborn spirit. As soon as she became accustomed to her new elements which surrounded her, she descended from her elevated position, which was immediately over the body, by an effort of willpower, and directly passed out of the door of the bedroom in which she had been lain, in the material form, prostrated with disease for several weeks. It being in the summer month, the doors were all open, and her egress from the house was attended with no obstruction. I saw her pass through the adjoining room, out of the door, and step from the house into the atmosphere. I was overwhelmed with delight and astonishment when, for the first time, I realized the universal truth that the spiritual organization can tread the atmosphere, which is impossible while in the coarser earthly form. So much more refined is man's spiritual constitution. She walked in the atmosphere as easily and in the same manner as we tread the earth, and ascended eminence. Immediately upon her emergence from the house, she was joined by two friendly spirits from the spiritual country, and after tenderly recognizing and communing with each other, the three, in a most graceful manner, began ascending obliquely through the ethereal envelopment of her globe. They walked so naturally and fraternally together that I could scarce realize the fact that they trod the air. They seemed to be walking upon the side of a glorious but familiar mountain. I continued to gaze upon them until the distance shut them from my view, whereupon I returned to my external and ordinary condition. This account of the facts, of what actually happened at death, is confirmed by numerous other witnesses, who agree as to the main details. The end of The Portal of the Unknown by Andrew Jackson Davis, the Seer. The Sacredness of Work by Thomas Carlyle. From Standard Selections, a collection and adaptation of superior productions from best authors, for use in classroom and on the platform, arranged and edited by Robert I. Fulton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dale Grothmann. The Sacredness of Work by Thomas Carlyle. All true work is sacred. In all true hand labor there is something of divineness. Labor, wide as the earth, has its summit in heaven. Sweat of the brow, and up from that to sweat of the brain, sweat of the heart, which includes all Kepler's calculations, Newton's meditations, all sciences, all spoken epics, all acted heroism, martyrdoms, up to that agony of bloody sweat which all men have called divine. Oh, brother, if this is not a worship, then I say the more pity for worship, for this is the noblest thing yet discovered under God's sky. Who art thou that complainest of thy life of toil? Complain not. Look up, my wearied brother. See thy fellow workmen there, in God's eternity, surviving there, they alone surviving, sacred band of the immortals, celestial bodyguard of the empire of the mind. Even in the weak human memory they survive so long, as saints, as heroes, as gods, they alone surviving, peopling the immeasurable solitudes of time. To thee heaven, though severe, is not unkind. Heaven is kind, as a noble mother, as that Spartan mother saying, while she gave her son his shield, "With it, my son, or upon it." Thou, too, shall return home, in honor to thy far distant home. Doubt it not, if in the battle thou keep thy shield. The end of The Sacredness of Work by Thomas Carlyle.
Tradition and the Individual Talent. An essay taken from The Sacred Woods by T.S. Eliot, published in 1922. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This essay is read by Sumit Waghmare. Section 1. In English writing, we seldom speak of tradition, though we occasionally apply its name in deploring its absence. We cannot refer to the tradition or to a tradition. At most, we employ the adjective in saying that the poetry of so and so is traditional or even too traditional. Seldom, perhaps, does the word appear except in a phrase of censure. If otherwise, it is vaguely approbative with the implication as to the work approved of some pleasing archaeological reconstruction. You can hardly make the work agreeable to English ears without this comfortable reference to the reassuring science of archaeology. Certainly, the word is not likely to appear in our appreciations of the living or dead writers. Every nation, every race has not only its creative but its own critical turn of mind, and is even more oblivious of the shortcomings and limitations of its critical habits than of those of its creative genius. We know, or think we know, from the enormous mass of critical writing that has appeared in the French language, the critical method or habit of the French, and we only conclude, we are such unconscious people, that the French are more critical than we, and sometimes even plume ourselves a little with the fact, as if the French were the least spontaneous. Perhaps they are, but we might remind ourselves that criticism is as inevitable as breathing, and that we should be none the worse for articulating what passes in our minds when we read a book and feel an emotion about it, for criticizing our own minds in their work of criticism. One of the facts that might come to light in this process is our tendency to insist when we praise a poet upon those aspects of his work in which he least resembles anyone else. In these aspects or parts of his work, we pretend to find what is individual, what is peculiar essence of the man. We dwell with satisfaction upon the poet's difference from his predecessors, especially his immediate predecessors. We endeavor to find something that can be isolated in order to be enjoyed. Whereas, if we approach a poet without this prejudice, we shall often find that not only the best, but the most individual parts of his work may be those in which the dead poets, his ancestors, assert their immortality most vigorously. And I do not mean the impressionable period of adolescence, but the period of full maturity. Yet if the only form of tradition of handing down consisted in following the ways of the immediate generation before us in a blind or timid adherence to its successes, tradition should be positively discouraged. We have seen many such simple currents, soon lost in the sand, and novelty is better than repetition. Tradition is a matter of much wider significance. It cannot be inherited, and if you want it, you must obtain it by great labor. It involves, in the first place, the historical sense, which we may call nearly indispensable to anyone who would continue to be a poet beyond his 25th year. And the historical sense involves a perception, not only of the pastness of the past, but of its presence. The historical sense compels a man to write, not merely with his own generation in his bones, but with the feeling that the whole of the literature of Europe from Homer, and within it the whole of the literature of his own country, has a simultaneous existence and composes a simultaneous order. This historical sense, which is a sense of the timeless as well as of the temporal, and of the timeless and of the temporal together, is what makes a writer traditional, and it is at the same time what makes a writer most acutely conscious of his place in time, of its contemporaneity. No poet, no artist of any art has his complete meaning alone. His significance, his appreciation, is the appreciation of his relation to the dead poets and artists. You cannot value him alone. You must set him for the contrast and comparison among the dead. I mean this as a principle of aesthetic, not merely historical criticism. The necessity that he shall conform, that he shall cohere, is not one-sided. What happens when a new work of art is created is something that happens simultaneously to all the works of art which preceded it. The existing monuments form an ideal order among themselves, which is modified by the introduction of the really new work of art among them. The existing order is complete before the new work arrives. For order to persist after the supervention of novelty, the whole existing order must be, if ever so slightly, altered. And so the relations, proportions, values of each work of art towards the whole are readjusted, and this is conformity between the old and the new. Whoever has approved this idea of order, of the form of European, of English literature, will not find it preposterous that the past should be altered by the present as much as the present is directed by the past. And the poet, who is aware of this, will be aware of great difficulties and responsibilities. In a peculiar sense, he will be aware also that he must inevitably be judged by the standards of the past. I say judged, not amputated by them, not judged to be as good as, or worse, or better than the dead, and certainly not judged by the canons of the dead critics. It is a judgment, a comparison, in which two things are measured by each other. To conform merely would be for the new work, not really to conform at all. It would not be new, and would therefore not be a work of art. And we do not quite say that the new is more valuable because it fits in, but its fitting in is a test of its value. A test, it is true, which can be only slowly and cautiously applied, for we are none of us infallible judges of conformity. We say, it appears to conform and is perhaps individual, or it appears individual and may conform, but we are hardly likely to find that it is one and not the other. To proceed to a more intelligible exposition of the relation of the poet to the past, he can neither take the past as a lump, an indiscriminate bolus, nor he can form himself wholly on one or two private admirations, nor can he form himself wholly upon one preferred period. The first course is inadmissible, the second is an important experience of youth, and the third is a pleasant and highly desirable supplement. The poet must be very conscious of the main current, which does not at all flow invariably through the most distinguished reputations. He must be quite aware of the obvious fact that art never improves, but that the material of art is never quite the same. He must be aware that the mind of Europe, the mind of his own country, a mind which he learns in time to be much more important than his own private mind, is a mind which changes, and that this change is a development which abandons nothing en route, which does not superannuate either Shakespeare or Homer or the rock drawing of the Magdalenian draughtsman. That this development, refinement perhaps, complication certainly, is not, from the point of view of the artist, any improvement. Perhaps not even an improvement from the point of view of the psychologist, or not to the extent which we imagine. Perhaps only in the end based upon a complication in economics and machinery. But the difference between the present and the past is that the conscious present is an awareness of the past in a way, and to an extent which the past's awareness of itself cannot show. Someone said, the dead writers are remote from us because we know so much more than they did. Precisely, and they are that which we know. I am alive to a usual objection to what is clearly part of my program, for the nature of poetry. The objection is that the doctrine requires a ridiculous amount of erudition, pedantry, a claim which can be rejected by appeal to the lives of poets in any pantheon. It will be even affirmed that much learning deadens or perverts poetic sensibility, while however we persist in believing that a poet ought to know as much as will not encroach upon his necessary receptivity and necessary laziness, it is not desirable to confine knowledge to whatever can be put into a useful shape for examinations, drawing rooms, or the still more pretentious modes of publicity. Some can absorb knowledge, the more tardy must wait for it. Shakespeare acquired more essential history from Plutarch than most men could from the whole British Museum. What is to be insisted upon is that the poet must develop or procure the consciousness of the past, and that he should continue to develop this consciousness throughout his career. What happens is a continual surrender of himself, as he is at the moment, to something which is more valuable. The progress of an artist is a continual self-sacrifice, a continual extinction of personality. There remains to define this process of depersonalization and its relation to the sense of tradition. It is in this depersonalization that art may be said to approach the condition of science. I shall therefore invite you to consider as a suggestive analogy the action which takes place when a bit of finely filleted platinum is introduced into a chamber containing oxygen and sulfur dioxide. Section 2. Honest criticism and sensitive appreciation is directed not upon the poet but upon the poetry. If we attend to the confused cries of the newspaper critics and the susurrus of popular reputation that follows, we shall hear the names of poets in great numbers. If we seek not the blue book knowledge but the enjoyment of poetry and ask for a poem, we shall seldom find it. In the last article, I tried to point out the importance of the relation of the poem to other poems by other authors, and suggested the conception of poetry as a living whole of all the poetry that has ever been written. The other aspect of this impersonal theory of poetry is the relation of the poem to its author, and I hinted by an analogy that the mind of the mature poet differs from that of the immature one, not precisely in any valuation of personality, not being necessarily more interesting or having more to say, but rather by being a more finely perfected medium in which spatial or very varied feelings are at liberty to enter into new combinations. The analogy was that of the catalyst. When the two gases previously mentioned are mixed in the presence of a filament of platinum, they form sulfurous acid. This combination takes place only if the platinum is present. Nevertheless, the newly formed acid contains no trace of platinum, and the platinum itself is apparently unaffected, has remained inert, neutral, and unchanged. The mind of the poet is the shade of platinum. It may partly or exclusively operate upon the experience of the man himself, but the more perfect the art is, the more completely separate in him will be the man who suffers and the mind which creates. The more perfectly will the mind digest and transmute the passions which are its material. The experience, you will notice, the elements which enter the presence of the transforming catalyst are of two kinds, emotions and feelings. The effect of a work of art upon the person who enjoys it is an experience different in kind from any experience not of art. It may be formed out of one emotion, or may be a combination of several, and various feelings, inherent for the writer in particular words or phrases or images, may be added to compose the final result. Or great poetry may be made without the direct use of any emotion whatever, composed out of feelings solely. Canto 15 of the Inferno, Brunetto Latini, is a working up of the emotion evident in the situation, but the effect, though single as that of any work of art, is obtained by considerable complexity of detail. The last quatrain gives an image, a feeling attaching to an image, which came, which did not develop simply out of what precedes, but which was probably in suspension in the poet's mind until the proper combination arrived for it to add itself to. The poet's mind is in fact a receptacle for seizing and storing up numberless feelings, phrases, images, which remain there until all the particles which can unite to form a new compound are present together. If you compare several representative passages of the greatest poetry, you see how great is the variety of types of combination, and also how completely any semi-ethical criterion of sublimity misses the mark. For it is not the greatness, the intensity of the emotions, the components, but the intensity of the artistic process, the pressure, so to speak, under which the fusion takes place, that counts. The episode of Paolo and Francesca implies a definite emotion, but the intensity of the poetry is something quite different from whatever intensity in the supposed experience it may give the impression of. It is no more intense furthermore than Canto 26, the voyage of Ulysses, which has not the direct dependence upon an emotion. Great variety is possible in the process of transmission of emotion. The murder of Agamemnon or the agony of Othello gives an artistic effect, apparently closer to a possible original than the scenes from Dante. In the Agamemnon, the artistic emotion approximates to the emotion of an actual spectator. In Othello, to the emotion of the protagonist himself. But the difference between art and the event is always absolute. The combination which is the murder of Agamemnon is probably as complex as that which is the voyage of Ulysses. In either case, there has been a fusion of elements. The ode of Keats contains a number of feelings which have nothing particular to do with the nightingale, but which the nightingale, partly perhaps because of its attractive name, and partly because of its reputation, serve to bring together. The point of view which I am struggling to attack is perhaps related to the metaphysical theory of the substantial unity of the soul, for my meaning is that the poet has not a personality to express, but a particular medium, which is only a medium and not a personality, in which impressions and experiences combine in peculiar and unexpected ways. Impressions and experiences which are important for the man may take no place in the poetry, and those which become important in the poetry may play quite a negligible part in the man, the personality. I will quote a passage which is unfamiliar enough to be regarded with fresh attention in the light or darkness of these observations. Quote, "And now methinks I could even chide myself for doting on her beauty, though her death shall be revenged after no common action. Does the silkworm expend her yellow labours for thee? For thee doth she undo herself? Are lordships sold to maintain ladyships? For the pure benefit of a bewildering minute, why does yon fellow falsify highway, and put his life between the judge's lips? To refine such a thing, keeps horse and men to beat their valours for her?" Unquote. In this passage, as is evident if it is taken in its context, there is a combination of positive and negative emotions, an intensely strong attraction toward beauty, and an equally intense fascination by the ugliness which is contrasted with it and which destroys it. The balance of contrasted emotion is in the dramatic situation to which the speech is pertinent, but that situation alone is inadequate to it. This is, so to speak, the structural emotion provided by the drama. But the full effect, the dominant tone, is due to the fact that a number of floating feelings having an affinity to this emotion, by no means superficially evident, have combined with it to give us a new art emotion. It is not in his personal emotions, the emotions provoked by particular events in his life, that the poet is in any way remarkable or interesting. His particular emotions may be very simple, or crude, or flat. The emotion in his poetry will be a complex thing, but not with the complexity of the emotions of people who have very complex or unusual emotions in life. One error, in fact, of eccentricity in poetry is to seek for new human emotions to express, and in this search for novelty in the wrong place, it discovers the perverse. The business of the poet is not to find new emotions, but to use the ordinary ones, and in working them up into poetry, to express feelings which are not in actual emotions at all, and emotions which he has never experienced will serve his turn as well as those familiar to him. Consequently, we must believe that emotion recollected in tranquillity is an inexact formula, for it is neither emotion nor recollection nor, without distortion of meaning, tranquillity. It is a concentration and a new thing resulting from the concentration of a very great number of experiences which to the practical and active persons would not seem to be experiences at all. It is a concentration which does not happen consciously or of deliberation. These experiences are not recollected, and they finally unite in an atmosphere which is tranquil only in that it is a passive attending upon the event. Of course, this is not quite the whole story. There is a great deal in the writing of poetry which must be conscious and deliberate. In fact, the bad poet is usually unconscious where he ought to be conscious, and conscious where he ought to be unconscious. Both errors tend to make him personal. Poetry is not a turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. It is not the expression of personality, but an escape from personality. But of course, only those who have personality and emotions know what it means to want to escape from these things. Section 3. This essay proposes to halt at the frontier of metaphysics or mysticism, and confine itself to such practical conclusions as can be applied by the responsible person interested in poetry. To divert interest from the poet to the poetry is a laudable aim, for it would conduce to a juster estimation of actual poetry, good and bad. There are many people who appreciate the expression of sincere emotion in verse, and there is a smaller number of people who can appreciate technical excellence. But very few know when there is expression of significant emotion, emotion which has its life in the poem, not in the history of the poet. The emotion of art is impersonal, and the poet cannot reach this impersonality without surrendering himself wholly to the work to be done, and he is not likely to know what is to be done unless he lives in what is not merely the present, but the present moment of the past, unless he is conscious not of what is dead, but of what is already living. End of Tradition and Individual Talent by T.S. Eliot. The essay was read by Sumit Waghmare.
Excerpt from The Vanity of Arts and Sciences by Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa von Nettelsheim, 1486 to 1535. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. To the Reader. Studious reader, wilt thou not look upon this labor of mine to be a most bold and almost Herculean attempt to wage war against the giant-like opposition of all the arts and sciences, and thus to challenge the stoutest hunters of nature? Doctors will knit their enraged brows upon me. The authority of masters, the endeavors of the bachelors of art, the heat of the schoolmen, the sedition of the mechanics, will be all up in arms against me. All which if I stab at one blow, will it not be a greater work than Hercules in the accomplishment of all his labors was ever guilty of? Shall I not have performed a nobler task, if with no less danger and labor I overcome these monsters of schools, universities, and pulpits? For I am not ignorant how bloody a battle I must fight, or how hazardous and difficult the war will be, being to meet with such an army of potent enemies. Woe is me! With what engines will they seek to destroy me? With what weight will they not endeavor to crush me? What reproaches will they not endeavor to throw upon me? The grammarians will rail at me. The entomologists will derive my name from the gout. The mad poet will call me goat and momus. The frivolous historians will profane me beyond Pausanias or Herostratus. The obstreperous rhetoricians will plague me with their big words and mimical gestures. The quarrelsome logicians will confound me with their syllogisms. The nimble sophisters will saw my jaw with the snaffles of their subtle questions. The barbarous Lullist will make me mad with his absurd solecisms. The atom-numbering arithmeticians will set an host of usurers upon me. The gamesters will curse me. The musicians will sing ballads of me. The proud matrons will expel me their meetings. The wenches will deny to kiss me. The giggling girls will laugh and cry, I dance like a camel. The lewd players will kill me in a tragedy. The intricate geometrician will imprison me in his triangles and tetragonals. The vain painter will make me more ugly than an ape, or Thyristes himself. The cosmographer will banish me amongst the bears of Greenland. The astrologer will erect some wicked scheme or other for me. The physiognomist will defame me for being impotent. The epicures will bespew me to death. The tyrant will crucify me in Phalaris's bull. Hypocrites will declaim against me in their pulpits. The whores will pox me. The priests will excommunicate me. The blasphemous mariner will throw me overboard. The yawling hunter will set his dogs upon me. The soldier will plunder me. The ardor-tasting physicians will throw their urinal at my head. The chirurgeons will anatomize me. The lawyers will accuse me of treason. The judges will condemn me. Thus, though I omit for brevity's sake many others, dost thou not see, reader, what dangers I am like to run through? But I am in hopes to avoid their fury, provided that thou, patient to hear the truth, and laying all prepossession and obstinacy aside, wilt but give thy mind candidly and without passion to read what I have writ. I have, moreover, the word of God to defend me, which with an undaunted courage I intend to make use of for my buckler. I would have thee moreover to know, that I have not writ these things either out of hatred, envy, ambition, or vain error, nor did arrogance prompt me to it, but of all causes the most just and truest, because I see that so many men, puffed up with humane knowledge and learning, not only contemn and despise the oracles of the sacred Scripture, but also prosecute and deride it with the same contempt. Others we see, though to themselves they seem to be more holy, who endeavor to confirm and approve the laws of Christ, yet attribute more authority to the maxims of philosophers than to the holy prophets of God, the evangelists or apostles, though there be so vast a difference between them. Moreover, we find that a most detestable custom has invaded all or most schools of learning, to swear their disciples never to contradict Aristotle, Boethius, Thomas Albertus, or some such like school deity, from whom if there be any that differ so much as a nail's breadth, him they proclaim a scandalous heretic, a criminal against the holy sciences, fit only to be consumed in fire and flames. Therefore these audacious giants, these enemies of Scripture, are to be set upon, their bulwarks and castles are to be stormed, and it behooves us to show how intolerable the blindness of man is, to wander from the truth, misguided by so many sciences and arts, and by so many authors and doctors thereof. For how great a boldness is it, what an arrogant presumption, to prefer the schools of philosophers before the Church of Christ, and to extol or equal the opinions of men to the word of God. Lastly, how impious a piece of tyranny is it to captivate the wits of students to prefixed authors, and to deprive their disciples of the liberty of searching after and following the truth. All which things being so manifest that they cannot be denied, I may be the more easily pardoned if I seem to have more freely and bitterly inveighed against some sorts of sciences and their professors. Farewell. End of Letter to the Reader, from the Vanity of Arts and Sciences, by Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa von Nettelsheim, 1486 to 1535.